Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is let's start this from the beginning in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 56, Kabasawa Mines 2. Let's start this from the beginning. Kabasawa Mines 2. While there was a certain urgency to their mission, it wasn't to the point where Itaka saw it necessary to push his students to their limits. They needed to get to the mines in a reasonable amount of time, yes, but the threat of the boars wasn't enough to justify bringing the 3 genin that traveled with him to the brink of exhaustion. They still needed to track the beasts in question down and subsequently slay them, after all. They wouldn't be able to do that if they struggled to even stand. The most pressure came from the fact that no caravans would leave the mines until the mission was done, but even that wasn't too much of a problem. Upon Itaka's inquiry, the Hokage had explained to him that 5 days of travel would be perfectly sufficient, and as they had almost reached their goal already, even though it was only the afternoon of the 3rd day, they were well within their schedule. So far, their journey had proceeded just fine. After the initial excitement of traveling outside the village for the first time had worn off, Itaka had begun to use this opportunity to test their survival skills and knowledge in general. None of them would have a problem with hunting if they ever landed in a situation where that would be necessary, of course, but things such as which plants were poisonous and which were edible, how to find fresh water, or how to orientate themselves when in unknown territory were still very important. He obviously couldn't go too in-depth about any of that quite yet, considering they were on a schedule, but he planned to do so on their journey back. Maybe I should use this opportunity to conduct a survival test after the objective of the mission has been achieved, he mused. Sending a crow or a clone with the report should be more than sufficient for such an ultimately irrelevant mission. In the end, he decided to see how the rest of the mission would proceed first before making a final decision on that. If this turned out to be more strenuous than expected, his team would deserve a break rather than even more work. Life was rarely so nice, of course, but there was no problem with giving them some slack while they were still young. Besides, this was only their first mission. No need to ruin the experience too much. Sensei, Kiba's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. I have a question. Itaka shot the boy a look. He had been uncharacteristically silent for some time now, barely reacting to most of his teammates' attempts to include them in their conversation, and the frown on his face had deepened more and more the longer they walked. Moreover, even Akamura was behaving oddly. The dog usually spent most of his time either walking next to them or being carried by Kiba or by Itaka, for that matter. He was surprisingly fond of him for some reason. However, for the last few hours, he was running around sniffing everywhere while letting out low whimpers then and now. In and of itself, that wouldn't be too strange for a dog regardless of whether they were a Ninken or not, but in combination with Kiba's behavior, it certainly stood out. Hadn't the boy addressed him first, Itaka would have done so soon himself. Go ahead, he said. Well, he drawled, his eyes narrowed deep in thoughts. I'm not sure how to say it, but the boar attack on the trade caravan is supposed to have taken place not far from the mines, right? That is correct, yes. Kiba unconsciously nodded as if he had already expected that reply but hoped he would be wrong as he fell silent again. By now, all 4 of them had stopped in their tracks as not only he but Shino and Hinata too looked at Kiba with expressions that ranged from pensive to confused. Did you notice anything, Kiba? Itaka asked after a few seconds of silence when it became clear that the boy was so lost in thoughts that he had already forgotten about the conversation. Oh, yes. Sorry about that. It's just, well, weird. You see, even though we have almost reached our destination and should be really close to where the attack happened, neither Akamura nor I can detect even a whiff of the scent of a wild boar. Itaka had to agree that this was indeed strange. From what I understand, boars have a rather strong smell that lingers for quite some time. Kiba nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. We should have been able to get a hint of it by now. In fact, even you 3 would probably have been able to smell it if we had crossed an area where one of them stayed for a while. It really makes no sense. Isn't it possible that we're just not close enough yet? Hinata asked, even though she sounded doubtful of it herself, knowing full well just how good the noses of her teammate and his Ninken were. It was said that the attack happened not too far from the mines itself, but that's not really useful information, is it? It can mean everything from almost right in front of them to only a day's travel away. It would have been easy for us to miss the actual scene of the attack. Hinata wasn't exactly wrong. As the four of them took the most direct route towards their goal instead of following the winding street, they had been a fair distance away from it several times during their journey. It was definitively possible that Kiba and Akamaru had missed the boar scent because of that, especially if the wind wasn't in their favor. There was one thing this wouldn't explain, though. Furthermore, Shino spoke up. Couldn't you just miss the scent because you don't know what to look for? Neither of you two has ever encountered a wild boar before, right? We did, Kiba denied immediately with a jerky shake of his head. My mother spent a lot of time beating all kinds of knowledge into my head years ago. It was even worse than the academy. She brought me scent samples of all kinds of animals and made me learn everything about their behavior and other stuff like that. Besides, as Sensei said, their smell is very strong, disgustingly so. If any of that was here, it would be impossible to miss. Kiba then turned towards him, his expression growing a tad more serious. Wild boars are extremely territorial, especially the giant ones. It's also their mating season right now, so the likelihood that there are at least two rival male ones is very high, meaning their scent should be all over the place as they fight over who can claim this area. And even if that's not the case and it's only one male, its scent should still be here. However, I can't smell anything. Itaki had noticed that detail as well, but it was good to have Kiba confirming it for him. Usually, there should be no doubt about what had happened. If the report stated that wild boars were responsible for an attack on a caravan, there was no reason not to believe it. After all, if the culprit was unknown, it would have been stated as such. Even if the people who issued this mission to Konoha merely guessed, it would have made much more sense to assume that bandits were at fault rather than a bunch of animals that weren't even native to the region. Consequently, there should be boars in the area, and Kiba should be able to smell them. It seems this mission will be more complicated than expected, he thought while suppressing a sigh, but at least I can use this opportunity for a small test. All right, he said, the solemnity in his voice immediately catching the attention of his students. I will tell you now how we proceed from here, so listen closely. He caught the eyes of both Kiba and Shino. The two of you are going to head towards the street. I want you to find the scene of the attack and check it out for yourselves. If you don't find it immediately, you will travel down the road until you do, but take care to go no further than 1 day's worth of travel. For reference, we're now just about an hour from our destination away. Hinata and I will give you part of our supplies to make sure you don't lack anything. Then, he narrowed his eyes. No matter what you may find, do not engage in any combat, regardless of whether it is against a boar or anything, or anyone else. This is a scouting mission, not a combat one, do you understand? Both of them looked at him with perplexed expressions, not quite believing that he was giving them a task of their own that would take them away from his supervision. However, as soon as he asked his question, they simultaneously replied with an enthusiastic yes, Sensei. Good, Itaki nodded. If you find anything, return immediately and report to me. I will then make a decision on how we proceed from there based on the information, or the eventual lack thereof, you provide. He turned towards Hinata. In the meantime, the two of us will continue to travel towards our destination to check the situation there. I will explain the details to you on the way, but the short version is that I suspect some kind of foul play and want the aid of your Byakugan to get to the bottom of the matter. Hinata had briefly looked disappointed upon hearing that she wouldn't join her teammates, but as soon as she realized the importance of her own part, her expression turned into one of determination. Yes, Sensei. Technically, Genin teams weren't supposed to split up like that. This early into their training, Genin weren't allowed to leave the direct supervision of their Jonin instructors for long and could do so for even short amounts of time only when they were at least in pairs of two. Prolonged segregations were explicitly discouraged. If anything happened to them under these conditions, Itaka would be in a lot of trouble. It's a good thing I don't plan on leaving them unsupervised, then, he thought with a hint of amusement as he took advantage of Hinata's brief lack of attention to create a crow clone without her noticing as she stared at the departing figures of her teammates in the distance. After all, just because this was a good opportunity to see how they would act without either him or Hinata around to keep them in check didn't mean we would actually risk their lives. That would be nothing short of stupid. Here at Akihito's residence was perched on top of a hill overlooking not only the bustling town in the valley below but also the sea and the mines in the distance. Both the mansion itself as well as the adjoining gardens were enclosed by tall walls, and while Hinata didn't use her Byakugan to check, she thought she could safely assume that it was well manned from the bit she could see without it. Once the initial confusion at their presence had worn off after Ataka-sensei explained to the guard at the gates that the shinobi usually responsible for this area was unavailable due to his injuries and proved the legitimacy of their presence here with the mission scroll, they had been allowed to enter. They were then first accompanied by another guard until a servant who already awaited them at the mansion's entrance took over to lead them to here at Akihito, the noble in charge of both the mines and the region itself. Both the gardens and the building were stunningly beautiful, and while Hinata privately thought the gardens at her clan's compound had a much more elegant flair, she had no choice but to acknowledge that her home couldn't keep up with the interior of the mansion. The Hyuga clan was old and powerful, but they didn't surround themselves with great wealth. They had the money to do so if they wished, of course, but they preferred a more minimalistic approach. Rather than displaying power through expensive paintings and antique treasures, they presented themselves as well-refined and impressed with their behavior. It wasn't as if they didn't use their money at all, though. Certain powerful guests must be impressed the old-fashioned way or, as her father had put it once in a rare moment of visible frustration, in a way so blunt that even the greatest fool wouldn't fail to notice it. Maybe it was because of this that Hinata found the amount of wealth surrounding her so overwhelming. From expensive-looking tapestries to vases on pedestals and paintings on every wall, the mansion seemed to be nothing more than a means to show every guest just how rich its owner was. Hinata wouldn't even be surprised if the servant took a particularly long route just so that they could see more of it. There was no denying that it certainly was impressive. However, her initial shock aside, Hinata's mind was quick to go back to her mission. As breathtaking as the sights might be, it wasn't enough to make her forget what Ataka-sensei had told her shortly after they had split up with Shino and Kiba. While there wasn't yet enough proof to make any concrete accusations, he suspected that Tsuyodu, who was the usual ambassador for missions from the Kabasawa mines, and here at Akihito might be involved in some kind of backroom deal to divert money into their own pockets. If the two worked together, it would be easy to claim that the goods had been lost because the latter's merchants had been attacked on the route rather than because they sold it elsewhere underhand. Tsuyodu would be employed to take care of the non-existing problem, claim the culprits had already sold the stolen goods, and then travel back home to report the alleged success of the mission. In the meantime, Akihito could sell the iron elsewhere to the highest bidder to get some extra profit without Konoha being any the wiser. After all, with the stronghold Konoha had on all iron trade within the Land of Fire due to its importance to shinobi, it was only natural that they wouldn't pay as much as regular customers. This theory also threw a new light on the conversation they had in the Sandame's office about the unnatural high payment. It was possible that the reason why their client was ready to pay so much was to legally transfer Tsuyodu his share of the illegally earned money without anyone noticing. The only thing that really spoke against all of this was that the caravan had been attacked by giant boars, not bandits. One could claim that some of the goods were lost in the chaos, but certainly not enough to make it worthwhile to sell them elsewhere. It was possible to claim that the goods had been stolen from the scene after the merchants abandoned the goods to flee from the attack, but Hinata found it strange to think they would go to such lengths when they could just claim bandits were at fault. Ataka-sensei had acknowledged that she had a point when she brought that to his attention, but according to him, this might simply be a way to throw off suspicions. After all, people would start to wonder how the deliveries could possibly be attacked by bandits all the time and why the Hokage wasn't doing anything about it. In the worst case, Konoha might decide to carry out a territory-wide operation to wipe out all the bandits in the area only to notice that there aren't many of them in the first place. They didn't have any proof for this theory, of course. Her sensei didn't even seem to think that it was very likely that the situation was like that. One could never be too suspicious, though. Consequently, they were here to find out the truth. Hinata wasn't entirely sure what her task would be yet. All she had been told was that her Byakugan would be essential for their research. The lack of knowledge didn't do much to keep her excitement in check, however. She had briefly been disappointed when Shino and Kiba were told to go off on their own while she would stay back with their sensei, but in hindsight, she thought she might have actually gotten the better end of the deal. After all, how many genin could claim they engaged in espionage to uncover some insidious scheme on their very first mission? While she had been just as excited as her teammates when they had been told they would finally go on a C-rank mission, she had also been the most nervous one from their group, but now, all of that was gone, replaced by excitement. It was probably because of this excitement that Hinata, for once, didn't have a problem with straightening her spine and putting on a neutral expression befitting of the Hyuga heiress, as it felt less like a chore and more like part of her mission. Ota-sama would be proud. The world loved to play games with her, however, and it was only by a hair that she managed to keep her expression neutral at the strange greeting they received when they entered what seemed to be their host's private reception room. Itaki Uchiha. I can't say you're the man I expected to see, but I would lie if I claimed to be disappointed by this turn of events. It's a great honor to meet you. While certainly still filled with expensive and high-quality furniture, the room seemed much more lived in than the ones she had seen while walking through the mansion's corridors, and there were currently 3 people other than Hinata and her sensei present in it. There was the one who had greeted Itaka-sensei, of course. He was a man who looked in his early 20s and wore colorful robes of gold and white that were held together by a red obi around his waist. He also wore a wide grin on his face as he rushed forwards to meet them. The other 2 men who stood further back and watched the scene unfold from afar were both at least twice that old. One of them wore a set of blue robes not unlike the ones the first person wore, albeit less expensive, while the other wore a simple set of dark red armor that appeared more ceremonial than practical. Furthermore, while the latter had still a head full of dark hair in contrast to the former's bald head, the greatest difference between them was that the latter spotted a dark frown while the former looked at them neutrally. Akihito Dano, her sensei, greeted the man that had spoken up first as he shook the offered hand, since when did nobles shake hands? With a smile that Hinata easily recognized as fake. It's a pleasure to meet you. I hope it's not an inconvenience that my team was sent instead of Tsuyoda-san. I understand you're used to working with him whenever you require the aid of Konoha. The other man let out a boisterous laugh that made Hinata seriously question whether they really had the right person. Weren't nobles supposed to act more noble? More refined? Oh, it's not an inconvenience at all, Akihito assured them. Quite the opposite, in fact. It's a shame that Tsuyoda has been unable to come, but I'm thrilled to be able to meet you. You see, about 10 years ago, my father took me with him to watch the finals of the Chunin exams, and I had the great pleasure of watching you fight. It was certainly most impressive seeing someone just a little bit younger than myself do the things you did. I'm sure I annoyed my parents for months afterwards by never shutting up about wanting to become a shinobi myself. Usually, Hinata would have been interested in hearing more about her sensei's past. After all, while she might technically know from the gossip mill that he had put on quite a show during his Chunin exams, she had never heard any details. Unfortunately, all she was capable of at the moment was trying, and failing, to imagine this loud and expressive man as a shinobi. She was aware that she had attributes unsuitable for a kunoichi as well, but he was in a league of his own. I'm sure you would have been a great asset to our village, Itaka-sensei said with a slight tilt of his head, and to her great awe, even Hinata, who had known him for a while now, could not detect any insincerity in his voice, even though she knew that he couldn't possibly be serious. I wouldn't be so sure about that. My mother always used to say that I'm not cut from the right cloth for that kind of lifestyle. Alas, I had to settle for arranging for you to have the weapons you need to do your job. Not quite as adventurous, I'm afraid, but still a very essential task if I may say so myself. And we're most thankful for your contribution. Then, to emphasize that point, he exaggeratedly patted the weapon pouch on his left leg to make the kunao and shuriken inside of it rattle, resulting in yet another laugh from Akihito. As distracting as it was to not only meet such an unusual noble but to also have her sensei act so out of character right in front of her, Hinata didn't fail to notice that the man wearing armor tensed at the action, and that even when nothing more happened and he relaxed again, his frown was even deeper than before. Well, I'm grateful to have been of use to you, Akihito said in good humor before turning towards her with a genuinely curious expression while still continuing to address Itaka-sensei. I admit, I haven't heard of you taking a genin team. You would think this news were all over the place by now. The last school year ended, what, a month ago? 2? How haven't I heard about this before? Itaka-sensei gave a short, polite chuckle before he put a hand on her shoulder. This is our first mission outside the village. I'm sure the news will spread from here soon enough. He then gently squeezed her shoulder to kindly but ultimately unnecessarily forewarn her that she would need to speak in a moment. "This is one of my students, Hinata Hyuga." She took a half step forward to bow, taking care to lower herself just a little less than she usually would have. It might be interpreted as rude, but what little she saw from the man so far made her believe that he probably didn't care much about decorum, so being somewhat more informal might actually endear her to him. "It's nice to meet you, Akihito Dano." Judging from not only his reaction but, more notably, Itaka-sensei's lack of reaction, she had focused on his chakra just in case, looking for even the slightest hint of agitation in it that would point towards him being displeased. At her action, she tentatively assumed she had made the right call. "Oh my, how polite you are. And your first mission too, you say? How exciting. Dare say, are you by chance Hayashi-san's daughter?" While Hinata managed to keep her reaction under control, she still blinked in surprise at that. "I am," she confirmed with a slight tilt of her head. "If I may ask, Akihito Dano, how do you know my father?" "Well, he visited my family years ago to meet me when I was still young, of course." He shot her a conspiratorial wink. "My great-grandmother was a Hyuga, you see. A member of your family visits the mine to meet each of our children in case one of us awakens the Byakugan." Suddenly, his shoulders sagged and he let out a deflated sigh. "As you can imagine, I was most disappointed when he judged that I would never obtain it myself. I was still hoping to become a shinobi at that time. But well, I shouldn't have been surprised, I guess. No one in my family has been so fortunate in all these years, after all." Hinata managed a polite smile even though her blood ran cold. "I see," she said, proud of herself for speaking without a tremor in her voice. "Maybe your children shall be more fortunate, then." She barely registered Akihito's next laugh, and neither did she truly pay attention to his words. Instead, she couldn't help but think about the information she had just received. While it was rare for a Hyuga to marry outside the clan, it did happen on occasion. Usually because they had scored a favorable match that brought advantages to the clan, sometimes, but much rarer, because of true love. The former had gradually become less and less common since the creation of Konoha, however. The relative security that the village offered its inhabitants, and especially the clans that had previously fought in never-ending wars for centuries, made the need for such matches more or less superfluous. They still happened on occasions, but for the most part, the political games the clans played these days didn't require such arranged marriages anymore. However, Hinata knew her clan's history and thus had a very good idea of how these unions usually ended. After all, clans with bloodlines like the Hyuga couldn't just leave random people running around with a Byakugan. During the Warring States period, her clan regularly ended these families themselves a generation or two after the union happened or whenever the connection to them wasn't adventurous enough anymore to let them be. The best children from such families could hope for at that point was that they were adopted into the clan, and that only ever happened if they happened to possess the Byakugan. They never left any proof behind that they had been the ones to kill them, of course. No family would want to marry them if they knew they would ultimately be killed. Akihito was lamenting the fact that his family hadn't awakened the Byakugan, something that was thankfully enough unlikely to happen at this point considering the relation has been so long ago, when in truth, he should rejoice. Times were different today, but for all that Hinata would love to claim otherwise, she couldn't with absolute certainty say that her father wouldn't have disposed of them if they had. Again, the best they could have hoped for in that case was being forcefully adopted into the Branch family. And considering he had apparently made no secret of his visit here, she could also assume that he would have the backing of the village on that approach. After all, no village wanted one of its weapons in the hands of an outsider. Hinata only managed to push these dark thoughts aside and listen to the conversation again when the man turned back to her sensei. "I'm a bit confused, though. Don't teams usually have 3 genin instead of just 1? Itaka-sensei nodded. "That is indeed the case, Akihito Dano. However, I decided to split up before we arrived here to have them scout the scene of the incident. It's important to look for clues and sense as quick as possible. Far be it from me to criticize the way you work, but will 2 genin be enough for that? Wouldn't it have been better if you accompanied them yourself? As much as I enjoy your company, I would have been more than willing to wait a bit longer if that's what it takes to care of our little boar problem. There's no need to worry. The two of them are an Inyazuka and an Abarame respectively. As I'm sure you know, their clans are better suited for these kinds of tasks than anyone else. I guarantee you that they will do a splendid job. Akihito's expression, which had slowly begun to fall, immediately brightened at that. Well, if that's the case, there really is nothing to worry about. Forgive me for ever doubting you. Then, his expression changed once more, this time into a thoughtful frown. But an Abarame, you say? I look forward to meeting them. I just recently bought some new clothes which I was told were made from silk produced by their clan. These kinds of robes are very expensive, you know, but worth every single ryo. Oh, right, Hinata thought. Shino's clan does that as well, don't they? It was easy to forget because Shino had no interest in it and thus didn't talk about it a lot, but in the end, it was hardly a secret. While the Abarame naturally consisted of mostly shinobi, there were civilians as well. However, the difference to the civilians of other clans was that they too received their clan's secret technique. Or, to be more precise, they too became hosts to a colony of insects. They didn't use them for combat, though, but for more commercial uses. Silk production, for example. It was a tradition by now that a certain number of members in every generation of Abarame breed a particular kind of silkworms just for that use, bringing a lot of wealth into their coffers every year. It was the most high-quality silk on the continent, after all. I'm sure he will be honored to meet you as well, Itaka-sensei said to the apparent joy of Akihito, but before the other man could reply, another voice spoke up. As nice as all of this is, they're still inexperienced children. Special families or not, they shouldn't do such important work on their own. I don't like shinobi interfering with my job, but Tsuyodu at least takes his tasks serious enough to do them himself. This is ridiculous. The person who had spoken up was one of the men that had watched the conversation silently from afar up to this point. More specifically, it was the one who wore armor and spotted a dark frown on his face. Makata, Akihito said with a long-suffering sigh. Don't be like that in front of our guests, please. Although his superior told him so, the man who was apparently called Makata only scoffed. I will act as I please when shinobi are involved. He would probably have said even more, but the last man took a step forward to put a calming hand on Makata's shoulder. Please, my friend. Calm down. I'm sure dash. No, he interrupted him as he shook off the hand. My men are already out there, searching for these beasts. This interference is entirely unnecessary. And yet none of them has returned with useful information, or have they? That's dash. Enough. Akihito interrupted the two, and for the first time since their arrival, Hinata felt like standing in front of an actual noble. You're embarrassing not only yourselves but me as well. Behave or be gone. The as of yet unnamed man didn't seem too bothered by that reprimand as he bowed with a soft-spoken apology, but Makata did. He still shut his mouth and bowed as well, though, so he at least acknowledged Akihito's authority. I'm sorry for that poor show my subordinates just gave you, he told them with genuine embarrassment when he turned back to them. Please forgive me this unpleasantness. There is nothing to forgive, Itaka-sensei said with a small bow that Hinata quickly copied. No harm has been done. And yet I still apologize nonetheless. Then, Akihito straightened up. It seems I have been a bit too excited, however. I haven't even introduced you yet. These are my advisors Makata, he pointed at the grumpy man in the armor, and Nishin, he pointed at the other man who shot them a welcoming smile, who helped me in running the mining operations. Nishin helps me with accounting. Makata, on the other hand, is not only responsible for my safety but for the security of the nearby town and our caravans as well. Over 20 of his men have died in the most recent attack, so I ask you to forgive him his recent outburst. As I said, no harm has been done, Itaka-sensei assured Akihito once more. I can understand being tense after such a loss. Makata looked as if he wanted to say just what he thought of his understanding, but a warning look from Nishin stopped him in his tracks. Probably for the better, Hinata thought. It would surely not have been anything polite. She couldn't really fault him, though. While she hadn't lost many people in her life, just the memory of when her mother died felt like a sucker punch to the gut. He had probably been not as close to the guards as she had been to her mother, but even if they had been only acquaintances whose relationship was solely professional, losing so many of them must have hurt. Anyway, Akihito continued vigorously, having regained his earlier high spirits, I kept you long enough. I'm sure you plan to stay here until the rest of your team arrives, correct? Wonderful. One of the servants will show you to your rooms where you can freshen up. I plan to hold a feast in your honor tonight. Someone will get you in time, so don't you worry. Suddenly, everything happened very quickly as servants rushed to either serve Akihito and his advisors in some capacity or, as they had been told, lead them to their rooms. Hinata couldn't say she minded that. This conversation had been unexpectedly exhausting even though she had barely participated in it. A break to freshen up sounded quite nice. Unless her sensei needed her for something, she planned to fully enjoy the break she just got. Especially in view of the upcoming feast in the evening. Fortunately, he didn't. It was only much later, when she was already in the unaccustomed but definitively not unwelcome luxury of her room, that she remembered what he had told her about his theory. She had been supposed to look for hints in his behavior for anything that seemed off, but all of that had been forgotten the moment he had introduced himself in such an uncharacteristic manner for a noble. Hinata hadn't been able to concentrate on her task and, in fact, even forgot that she had a task at all. All at once, her euphoria about being allowed to accompany Ataka-sensei and the contentment she felt as she relaxed on the soft bed in her room were gone. How am I going to explain to Ataka-sensei that I didn't do what he asked of me? Chapter 57, Kabasawa Mines 3. Let's start this from the beginning. Kabasawa Mines 3. Kiba dash. I know. Just a little bit longer, okay? I'm sure it can't be far now. Just like you were sure of that when you said it an hour ago? Or the hour before that? While Shino thought that, he didn't speak it out loud. After all, it wasn't as if he couldn't understand why Kiba was so determined not to give up. He felt exactly the same way. Itaka-sensei had entrusted them with this, so they both obviously wanted to succeed in finding the scene of the attack. Furthermore, the fact that they had traveled for almost a day already while doing only the bare minimum of breaks necessary without finding anything made the entire situation all the more suspicious, meaning the success of their task might actually prove essential later on. Giving up before they found something, anything, just didn't sit right with either of them. Unfortunately, Shino hadn't asked because he truly thought they should turn around but because they had not much of a choice in that matter. Sensei said to go no further than 1 day worth of travel, he reminded his teammate, ignoring the annoyed look the other boy shot him. We can't go much further. Shino had to hand it to Kiba that his self-control had improved immensely over the last few weeks. Back during their early days as a team, and for the years of their acquaintance before that, he wouldn't have accepted this truth and complained about it instead. He might have restrained himself as long as their sensei was present, of course, but once he was gone, he would have started to grumble about how unfair the situation was. Now, on the other hand, he kept his composure. Oh, his expression was pinched while a low growl crept from his throat, making it clear for all the world to see that he was just as displeased about this as Shino, but ultimately, he didn't argue with him. Shino was genuinely impressed with that development. It also made him wonder what kind of changes he himself had undergone he wasn't aware of and what his teammates were thinking about them. But then again, Itaka-sensei probably wouldn't have allowed them to go off on their own if he didn't think they were both ready. I know, Kiba repeated once more, visibly restraining himself to not raise his voice. Listen, we ran off during midday, right? The sun is not yet at its zenith, so let's give it a bit more time. I will be the first one to turn around if we still haven't found anything by then. That was a reasonable proposal. Besides, it would give them a bit more than an hour to continue their search, giving Shino exactly what he wanted as he was all in favor of continuing. With a good reason to back that decision up, he saw no reason whatsoever to turn around quite yet. However, before he had the chance to express his agreement, Akamaru's bark caught both their attention. Akamaru! Kiba exclaimed excitedly, completely ignoring Shino in favor of running up to his ninkin. Did you find something, boy? The dog gave another bark that even Shino recognized as an affirmation, and while his face didn't immediately lit up like Kiba's, he couldn't have suppressed the smile that crept up his lips even if he would have wanted to. Ha, I knew we could do it. Kiba turned around to shoot him, the kind of cocky grin Shino had found aggravating just a few weeks ago but now seemed oddly contagious. Good thing we didn't give up, eh? We finally have a trail. Let's go. Kiba didn't even wait for him to reply before he jumped away to follow the trail Akamaru had found, leaving Shino with no other choice but to follow after them. Not that he minded, of course. For once, Kiba's brashness and cockiness didn't feel overbearing or annoying. It didn't feel like he was looking down on him at all. He had also said that he knew they could do it. Kiba had included him without even thinking about it, counting this as a win for both of them rather than just for himself, even though it was his, or, to be more precise, his Ninken's, nose that had found the scent. For that alone, Shino could overlook his behavior. Once Akamaru had helped Kiba find the trail, the boy quickly took the lead, guiding their group away from their previous eastward course and moving them further north instead. Meanwhile, Shino made sure to send his Kikaichu out in larger and larger quantities to make sure nobody would be able to sneak up on them. The likelihood of them being attacked here was slim, of course, but one could never be too careful. Especially not with the mystery of the boar attack still not being solved yet. And with Kiba occupied otherwise and the rest of their team being absent, the job of keeping aware of their surroundings fell to him. They had kept a more economical pace till now to conserve their stamina, well aware that they would probably be traveling for quite some time and that tiring out prematurely would be a bad thing, but that changed now. With an actual trail to follow, there was no reason not to hurry. They didn't outright run as fast as they could, but definitively much faster than before. Even so, they still needed more than half an hour to actually find the scene of the attack. Is it just me or is this a bit underwhelming? Shino shook his head, his forehead furrowed in consideration. It isn't just you, no. There were about 2 or 3 dozen carts, half of which were overturned while the rest stood abandoned on the side of the route. Furthermore, regardless of whether they still stood on their wheels or not, most showed varying amounts of damage which clearly indicated that an attack had taken place. What stood out much more than that, however, were the various corpses lying around. Not of humans, though. Instead, there were countless carcasses of horses and oxen in different stages of decay. Many showed signs of having been fed on by animals, too. None of this was strange. In fact, it was just as one might expect from such a scene. 2 things stood out to Shino which bothered him, though. First, as far as he could see, all carts had been looted of all their good. There were neither raw materials nor any other products left to be found. He would need to take a closer look to make sure he wasn't overlooking something, but as far as he could tell right now, there was truly nothing left. There were obviously some possible explanations for this. For example, bandits, or even just random people passing by could have taken it, using the opportunity to enrich themselves. Considering how much stuff must have been lying around here, however, that was rather unlikely. Unless it was a big group of bandits, there was no way everything could be gone. Second, there were no human corpses. He had sent out his Kikaicho just to be sure there were none hidden beneath some rubble, but considering they didn't find anything either, he could be relatively sure that there was indeed nothing to be found. That was probably the strangest thing. It shouldn't be possible for there to be no casualties after an attack that resulted in so much damage. Consequently, there should be at least a few corpses. Again, there were a few explanations that could potentially make sense of the situation, but Shino didn't think any of them was quite sufficient. For example, their client could have sent a party to collect the bodies. That would also explain where all the goods had vanished. After all, if one already sent a part to collect the bodies, why not let them get all the valuable goods as well? Unfortunately, while this sounded good in theory, it was unlikely to be the case. There had simply been not enough time to amass a party big enough to do these things that then also traveled all the way here. Civilians would be much slower than Shino and Kiba, who were shinobi, especially if they needed to travel with bulky carts to carry all the stuff, so the journey alone would probably take several days. No, Shino was sure that wasn't what had happened. It could also be that the survivors of the attack returned to collect the bodies of their comrades, and while this was already more likely, it still didn't solve the problem of the vanished goods. "Hey, Shino," Kiba called from Shino's right where he had been examining some wreckages. "There's something strange here." Discarding his musings for the moment, he began moving towards his teammate. Something strange, you say? Somehow, Shino doubted he was talking about the things he had been thinking about himself. While Kiba would probably notice these details himself if he actually examined the scene at large, he had been busy with other things. He didn't quite know what it was exactly they were looking for, but the way Kiba and Akamaru had slowly but surely followed some invisible trail to the outskirts of the scene off the road and close to the tree line proved that there was something specific that bothered them. Yes, Kiba confirmed, his face for once completely serious. Something very strange. He raised his hand and pointed at the tree line about 50 meters away from their position. I followed the trails of the boars, you see. They apparently broke through the carts and caused some chaos before running back into the forest over there. He then turned around to point at the trees right next to them. However, I can also smell that people took this path here as well. And I mean a lot of people. There shouldn't be much of a trace of human scent left by now, but it's actually so strong that it almost masks the one from the boars. They must have come and gone several times since the attack. Probably within the last few hours, too. That was indeed strange. Very strange, even. It could be the survivors of the attack who came back to collect their comrades' bodies, he said, voicing his earlier thoughts. While being drunk. Kiba snorted, a sardonic grin on his face. With how strong the smell of alcohol hangs in the air, I'm surprised you can't smell it as well. He couldn't, but if Kiba said it was there, he had no reason to doubt it. But why would they come all this way while being drunk? There was only one way to find out the answer to that. While Ataka-sensei technically hadn't forbidden them from following any other lead they potentially found, their task had been very clear: find the scene of the attack and then return to him and Hinata. What Shino, and, if he read the expression on his face correctly, Kiba as well, currently thought of was most certainly not part of that. However, not following up on this just felt wrong. There were pros and cons to this, arguments for and against it, but no matter how he looked at the situation, following the trail seemed like the right thing to do. After all, if something fishy was going on, there was the very real chance that this trail would already be cold by the time they returned with Ataka-sensei. Not only would they take considerably longer for the journey back now that they were already tired out, but they would also need to travel back here afterwards. At the very least, valuable clues might be lost by then. Moreover, he and Kiba had the kind of skill set that would allow them to remain unnoticed by anyone even if they followed this lead. They would notice anyone long before they noticed them, allowing them to retreat and hide if necessary. Yes, this was truly the most logical choice. Well then, Kiba said as if in reaction to his thoughts, shall we? Now was the last chance to change his mind, to tell Kiba they should turn around and get the rest of their team, but obviously, Shino didn't do anything like that. Lead the way. Ironically, this might very well be the first time they had been absolutely and unquestionable of the same mind on something. They had been given adjoining chambers, and even Itaki had to admit that their host had gone above and beyond to accommodate them. Having a roof over one's head was already considered a luxury for a shinobi on a mission, so having several rooms with expensive carpets, beautiful paintings, a bed big enough for 5 that was furnished with the finest satin, and even a private balcony with a perfect view of the garden and the town in the distance, to name just a few things, was a rare event indeed. Itaka's family was anything but poor, but as the Uchiha always preferred to use their wealth for more practical things, he couldn't say he was used to anything quite like this. Hinata would probably find this even more overwhelming than he did, too. After all, where he had experienced similar accommodations in the past, she certainly had not. They had even been given an entire wardrobe to use during their stay. This was actually something that had surprised even him. While it wasn't unheard of for wealthy clients to offer the shinobi they had hired robes they found more appropriate, he had never heard of a case where one offered an entire wardrobe just like that. The sheer amount of clothes in all kinds of sizes their host must have lying around just to be able to offer this to his guests must be astonishing. The paranoid part of him, the one that every shinobi possessed to keep themselves alive, had grown suspicious at these generosities. After all, just because he couldn't immediately find a possible explanation for how this action might be part of a plot to harm them didn't mean that there wasn't one. However, judging by the behavior their host had displayed earlier, which Itaki had tentatively deemed not to be an act, This was very much in character for the man, so he silenced the voice for the time being. It was this that led to him wearing the midnight blue robes, which were probably expensive enough to feed an average family of 3 for an entire year and would be more fitting for a high-ranking noble at the daimyo's court than for a mere shinobi, while taking small bites from the food in front of him, sitting to the left of Akihito himself with Hinata, who wore a white and red kimono more appropriate for a princess than a kunoichi, to his left respectively. The noble had held word and threw a feast for them, and it was only natural to be offered seats of honor at his side. While Itachi wasn't necessarily a fan of such events, particularly when he was at their center, he was thankful for this opportunity. After all, it gave him the chance to observe everyone important all at once, taking away the need to make in-depth reconnaissance work later on. Not only were all the important people of Akihito's administration, from minor nobles to influential residents of the town below, present, but most servants who worked at the mansion and many guards were as well. With how many guests there were, that wasn't much of a surprise. He would still need to do some research later, of course. This feast lightened his workload immensely, but it didn't take it away entirely. Maybe I should let Hinata do it instead, he mused silently even while he kept making meaningless small talk with one of the many guests that had approached him so far. She seemed rather disappointed with herself over her self-proclaimed failure. Itachi didn't blame her for being caught flat-footed by their host's behavior. Even he had been surprised by it. However, while she listened to his words when he told her just that, it was clear that she didn't take them to heart and that she blamed herself more than what was reasonable. Doing something she perceived as useful would surely lift her spirit. Throwing quick glances to his 2 neighbors, he confirmed that both were still busy. To his right, Akihito was having a rather animated conversation with someone who, judging by the calluses on his hands, his clothes that were scarcely appropriate for the setting, and the hard contours hiding underneath, could be a minor or even a retired guard, while Hinata to his left was talking to the lord's 9-year-old daughter, Nizu, who had been introduced to them at the beginning of the feast. The little girl had developed an instant liking for his student, apparently being fascinated by her eyes, and Hinata seemed more than happy to indulge her. While Hinata was good enough at hiding her discomfort at both the expensive robes she had been given and the feast itself to make sure no one but the most observant observer would notice, it was this distraction that allowed her to truly relax, and Itachi was glad for that. Partly because it wasn't good for her to be so tense all the time, partly because there was the chance that the little girl could let something slip while talking to her. Children were generally more loose-lipped than adults, after all. Deciding that now was as good a time as any, he excused himself from his own ongoing conversation and raised to his feet, only taking a few moments to notify his student what he was doing before slowly walking to a relatively empty part of the hall close to the arched windows that made up a large part of the northern wall from where one could look into the garden. It took less than a minute before the man whose eyes Itachi had felt on him for quite some time now approached him, a benign smile on his face and a drink in each of his hands. "Uchiha-san," he greeted him as soon as he was within talking distance and offered him one of the glasses. "I hope I'm not a bother, but I was hoping to speak with you." "Not at all, Nishin-san," he replied with a tilt of his head while accepting the offered drink. "I was merely enjoying the view. There's nothing comparable to these gardens back in Konoha, you see." Nishin, who was the advisor in charge of the treasury he and Hinata had met upon their arrival here, chuckled in response before pointing with his free hand towards the exit. "Would you like to take a closer look, then? It should be quieter outside as well. Much more pleasant to talk with each other, too." "It would be a pleasure." He let himself be led outside while continuing their meaningless chatter, both of them being well aware of the eyes on them. Whatever the other man wanted to talk with him about was apparently just as sensitive as what Itachi wanted to talk about with him, shining an entirely new light on his oh-so-innocent invitation outside. It was only once they had entered the gardens and were an appropriate distance away from the exit that Itachi decided to bring his subject up. "I haven't been able to spot Makoto-san all night," he said casually while observing his companion's reaction from the corner of his eyes. "Is he not a fan of feasts?" Nishin let out a soft chuckle that sounded like a mixture of amusement and exasperation. "He certainly isn't, no. He always complains about the costs no matter how often I tell him that he should let me worry about such things, and when it isn't that, then he complains about the additional workload for his men. He also never attends them himself if he can help it. Regardless, his absence tonight has less to do with his personal preferences and more with the fact that he left the mansion several hours ago. Oh. Itake already knew that, of course, having observed the column of riders leaving the place himself, but he still put a hint of surprise into his voice. There hasn't been another incident, I hope. My student and I would have been more than willing to help. That's why we're here, after all. Oh no, not at all. Unlike Akihito Dano, Mikata isn't a fan of shinobi, you see. As you surely remember, he took great offense to the news of your other two students already rushing to the scene of the attack, so he decided to rally some of his men and ride out himself. Naishin shook his head in clear disapproval. We had actually planned to send a party tomorrow morning. We sent out some men to collect the corpses and look for injured as soon as the news of the attack reached us, even before we sent a message to Konoha with our plea for aid, but organizing transport for all the good takes longer. I don't know for sure what he tries to accomplish by forcing this early departure, but if I had to take a guess, I would speculate that he doesn't want your team to solve this problem for us. He doesn't like shinobi, huh? So the party you sent out to collect the dead and look for injured has been on the move for about 5 days, then? Maybe they will encounter my other two students. While their knowledge in that field is very basic, they might be able to help with some minor injuries if they do meet. That's a very kind offer, but the party has returned 2 days before your own arrival. Your students might encounter Mikata, but other than his group, none of our people is currently on the road. That actually caught him by surprise. They have already returned. This soon. Assuming they set out a day or two before the message with the mission request arrived at Konoha, they would have been gone for something between 3 and 4 days. Their horses would have been more rested at the beginning, meaning they would have been faster during the first day before slowing down from then on. Especially if they needed to pull carts, and even more so if these carts were weighed down by the bodies of the injured and dead. With that in mind, the scene of the attack couldn't be too far away from here. However, Kiba and Shino still hadn't turned up. Even if they weren't running at their full speed, they should have been able to reach the scene and subsequently arrive at the mansion by now if the attack had happened this close to it. Itake would know if something had happened to them as he had sent a clone with them in secret, so there must be another reason for their delay. Indeed, Naishin agreed after he took a sip from his drink. Their timely return came as a surprise to all of us. Apparently, a few of the survivors managed to lift their dead comrades onto carts, put some horses in front of them, and make their way home. By the time the survivor who rode ahead to notify us about the attack arrived, they had already covered a good stretch of the way themselves, so our people didn't need to ride all the way to the scene itself to find them. That would explain some of his previous confusion, but Itake still felt unsatisfied with that answer. It made sense, but his gut told him that there was more to it. He didn't let these thoughts show on his face, though, and merely nodded in understanding. That is very fortunate indeed. I hope there haven't been too many casualties. The other man sighed. Not as many as it could have been, but too many still. There could also be even more dead whose bodies the survivors couldn't recover or people who managed to flee into the woods after the attack and died of their wounds later. The group brought 16 bodies with them, and of the 7 survivors that came back, 4 died within hours of their arrival. I'm sorry to hear that, he said with a slight bow of his head. Were you able to contact their families? For the first time since they moved outside, the other man smiled. Most of them, yes. There were some who were members of traveling merchant groups, but those that had family in the town were easy enough to be found. Most of them are present here tonight as well. Akihito Dano regularly invites both the simple miners and merchants to his feasts to show them his gratitude and, as it's the case with the families of the victims, sympathy. I did notice a surprising number of citizens at the feast. It's a most unusual action, I must say, but it surely helps in fostering good relations between Akihito Dano and the people. It does very much so. He even went as far as to arrange an entire wing of the mansion to be made available for them after yesterday's funeral. Needless to say, he's quite popular. That made Itake pause. There has already been a funeral as well. I assume you're surprised at how quickly it happened? Naishin asked with an understanding expression on his face. I'm inclined to agree, but most of the relatives wanted to have them receive the priest's blessing as soon as possible and Akihito Dano acquiesced. He pointed to his right. There is a special graveyard on the premise where all those who died while working for Akihito Dano's family get buried. Well, as long as their families agree, that is. Every time things start to make some sense, something new comes up. Itaka suspected from the very beginning that something weird was going on, and the longer he was here, the more sure of it he became. His first suspicion regarding some kind of foul play between Akihito and Tsuyodu, the shinobi usually in charge of missions related to the Kabasawa mines, was probably wrong, but there was clearly something going on behind the scenes. He had a few more ideas, of course, but speculating too much wouldn't do him any good right now. He needed more information before he could make any educated guesses. Everything else would be a waste of time and energy. Anyway, Naishin continued after a few moments of silence, let's not talk about this dreadful topic any longer. That's not what I approached you for anyway. In truth, I wanted to ask you for a favor, Uchiha-san. Itaka pushed his suspicions aside for the moment to focus back on the conversation on hand while making sure that his expression was as friendly and open as it could be without looking fake. If it's within my power, I would be more than happy to help you. I'm glad to hear that, he said, expressing his gratitude with a small bow. It's nothing complicated, I assure you. All I ask of you is to deliver a message to your Hokage. Now that was an interesting development. And what kind of message would that be? That it might be a wise decision to start looking for new sources of iron as the Kabasawa mines are beginning to dry up. His only reaction at this news was a single blink, but considering how much control he usually had over himself, even that was a tremendous thing. Although Itaki hadn't been living in Konoha anymore at this point in time of the former timeline, he would have heard if something important like the drying up of the Land of Fire's most important mines had happened. He didn't, though, so there should be no way for it to happen now. Is this confirmed? He asked, manipulating his voice to sound only appropriately grave instead of as suspicious as he felt. Are there any doubts whatsoever? The reply was immediate. It's not, no. Then, Naishin scoffed. Akihito Dano is an admirable man, but he also refuses to acknowledge the possibility that not only his family's pride and joy but also his income might be about to run out. He denies all of my requests to carry out a detailed inspection, and no matter what I try, he won't change his mind. If there has been no inspection, what makes you think the mines might be drying up? With every passing month, our men need to work longer and dig deeper to find the same quantities of iron ore as the month prior. There have been more accidents, too. Collapsed tunnels and the like. So far, the number of casualties remains relatively low, and Akihito's popularity keeps the people in check, but there's no telling how long that will last. In that case, you should have contacted Konoha much earlier, Itaka said. Even if it's not confirmed yet, this news would have been enough to make the Hokage insist on a closer inspection. Naishin bowed, lowering his head much more than a man of his station ever should. I should have, and I regret not having done so. Akihito Dano forbade me from speaking about this with anyone. I was afraid of what would happen if he found out I sent a secret message, so I remained silent. I understand now that this has been a mistake. One which innocent workers paid for with their lives. He looked up. I can't stay silent any longer, however. Not now that such an opportunity has presented itself. Tsuyoda-san agrees with Akihito Dano, that much has become clear during his last visit, but as it's you and your team who came this time instead of him, there is a chance for me to speak freely without fear. Depending on how things had played out during the last timeline, there was the distinct possibility that Naishin had never mentioned the drying up of the mines in the last timeline because of this fear. That would not only explain why Taki hadn't heard of this before but would also fit nicely with his first suspicion regarding Tsuyodu. However, just as he had mused earlier, there seemed to plop up another question whenever he thought he had found an answer, and this time was no different. As much as this explained a lot, it also left him with doubts. None of which he could address right now, though. I will pass on the message, he said instead, noting how Naishin's shoulders relaxed at his words. I will strive to finish this mission as quick as I can and then return to Konoha with all haste to make sure this can be dealt with as soon as possible. Your safety will naturally be guaranteed, so please don't worry. The other man bowed again, this time even lower than before. Thank you, Uchiha-san. You have no idea how grateful I am for that. The longer I'm here, the more suspicious things become. Itaka mentally repeated what he had thought earlier. How is it that the possibility of a bothersome but ultimately harmless backdoor deal developed into a potential iron crisis within a single day? He knew that it was almost a tradition for missions to go wrong, and that the first mission of Genin teams in particular tended to spiral out of control beyond even that, but this was simply ridiculous. Still, there was nothing he could do about it now other than observing how things developed from here. Then, depending on what news Kiba and Shino brought with them when they finally returned, he would decide whether they should act themselves or send a message to Konoha to have some other, more qualified team take care of this. Patience was a virtue, after all. Although Kiba knew that the situation was serious and that he should focus all his attention on the mission, but he couldn't not get distracted by how excited he was. This was, after all, his very first assignment outside the village and, maybe even more importantly, without the supervision of his sensei. Part of the reason he had been so determined to continue the search when Shino pointed out that they would need to return soon, not that he really wants to leave without getting some results first himself, that hypocrite, was that he didn't want to fail the very first time he had the chance to prove himself. To prove that he had taken his lessons to heart and that he could live up to his family's reputation as trackers. Having not only successfully found the scene of the attack but also a suspicious trail to follow was consequently like a dream come true. Kiba knew that they would need to report back to their sensei as soon as they found the people at the other end of the trail and that they couldn't, well, take care of them themselves, but just having found them was already great. Unless, of course, it turned out there was nothing suspicious going on at all and these people were mere innocent civilians who accidentally stumbled over the aftermath of the attack, in which case his and Shino's decision to go after them would have been nothing but a waste time. There was no use in worrying about that, though. They would find out whether that was the case or not sooner rather than later anyway. They had followed the trail for about half an hour now, with him and Akamaru in the lead while Shino covered their backs. They could have been faster, but considering they didn't want to risk being seen, they moved slower and more cautious than usual. Still faster than civilians could ever hope to be, but slower than Kiba would have liked. That actually makes things even more suspicious, Kiba thought. They wouldn't move such a distance as often as they must have judging from the strength of the scent if they weren't up for no good. Add to that the tracks of carriages they had found about 10 minutes away from the scene and everyone would be able to see that there was something fishy about the entire situation. Yeah, no way is this all just a big misunderstanding. The thought of that only excited him even more, and it took a considerable amount of effort to suppress the grin that tried to spread over his face in favor of focusing back on the mission. Thankfully, it was then that the sound of voices could be heard in the distance, giving him something to focus on other than his thoughts. "We're close to the camp," he whispered as he came to a stop on a tree branch, looking to his right where Shino had landed with an almost inaudible thump. "Are there any watchmen?" The scent had constantly grown stronger and stronger as they got closer. So strong, in fact, that he could no longer confidentially claim he would notice someone trying to sneak up on them with his nose alone, even if it irked him to admit that. There were simply too many other smells that obscured such minor details. Shino had no such problems, though. He waited in silence as his teammate held up one hand on which several insects landed within seconds, watching as he, well, communicated with them. To be completely honest, he had still no idea how that actually worked. If he wanted to speak with Akamaru, his companions would bark in response, and while most people might struggle to understand what he was trying to express from that alone, at least everyone could hear that he had done something. With Shino's insects, on the other hand, Kiba didn't notice anything that could count as communication. Regardless, it obviously worked and that was all that truly mattered. "There are 8 guards positioned around the camp," Shino said a few seconds later, finally breaking the tense silence. "However, judging from the amount of alcohol in their blood, they won't be much of a problem. Furthermore, there doesn't seem to be anyone with strong enough chakra to be a shinobi. As long as we move carefully and stay in the trees, we should be able to move closer while remaining relatively safe. Or be able to escape in case we're spotted after all," went unsaid. Kiba heard it clear as day. He didn't like the thought of it, but he understood the value of having an escape plan just in case. Nodding his understanding, he let Shino take the lead, realizing that his skills were better suited to get them closer without being seen than his own now that his nose was all but useless. It sucked, sure, but considering it was he who had led them this far, he supposed he could let Shino have the honor of this last part. It took only a little less than 3 minutes for them to reach the outskirts of the camp, which was located on a small clearing, spying down on it hidden from the treetops surrounding it. The camp, if it could even be called that, was chaotic and unorganized. Tents were erected all over the place without any apparent system in place. People loitered around half a dozen burned-down fireplaces with drinks in their hands that were clearly alcoholic in nature, and even more were just lying asleep on the ground in the most random of places, most likely having passed out there earlier. All in all, there were about 60 or 70 people. The only real thing of note was the pile of crates in the center of the camp whose content he couldn't see, but which Kiba would bet his left kidney on were the missing goods from the caravan the boars had attacked. Jackpot. It's a damn shame neither of us can use some kind of camouflage technique, Kiba muttered. He had heard of them but never thought of learning one himself. After all, apart from them being relatively hard to learn even for people with excellent chakra control, Kiba preferred a more straightforward approach, meaning he hadn't really seen the appeal before now. Do you think we could use a transformation technique to infiltrate the camp? Too risky, came the immediate response. The likelihood of this being a tightly knit group is too high. Transforming into a stranger would probably attract attention almost immediately, and transforming into one of them might become a problem if our acting is even just a little bit off or if we run into the person we're emulating. Kiba bristled at being shot down like this but kept his opinion to himself. Starting a fight about it now was a terrible idea, especially when he knew Shino was technically not even wrong. Doesn't mean I have to be happy about it, though. Putting these thoughts aside, he focused on trying to catch what the people closest to them were talking about. At least with so many of them being asleep, the overall noise level was lower than it could be, making that relatively easy. For the most part, nothing of note was being said. The vast majority of conversations were about booze, women, or various deeds the men had supposedly carried out in the past. Pretty boring, really. The topics of the conversations around them didn't get any better when he and Shino decided to split up and circle around the camp in opposite directions. If anything, it got worse as half of the groups were so deep in their cups that their voices were little more than unintelligible gibberish Kiba couldn't make any sense of. It was only when he had almost given up hope entirely and was considering just rushing in, knocking everyone out, and checking the crates himself that he finally overheard something that made him pay closer attention. Much longer do you think we have to stay here? Let me tell you, I'm damn tired of sleeping in a tent. Don't sweat it. It's no different from what we usually do when we travel, isn't it? Kiba turned around until he found the ones who were speaking, spotting the two men in leather armor standing a little apart from the nearest other group and having drinks in their hands that were, surprisingly enough, nothing alcoholic for once. At least we usually have a different scenery every day. Seeing all these idiots, he made a wide gesture towards the rest of the camp, only the fond tone of his voice belying his harsh words. Getting drunk day in and day out can't quite compare, don't you think? A small price to pay for all the money we get out of this if you ask me. The other man snorted. If there is anything left after deducting the cost for all our lost wagons and horses, you mean? Please, the second person said with a roll of his eyes and an amused grin on his lips. After this gig is over, we will have more than enough money to retire for good. Maybe start a little farm or something like that far away from here. He clapped the other man on the shoulder. You know what the boss said? Yeah, I know. Still doesn't mean I have to be happy to have so many of our animals trampled to death by oversized pigs, though. It's not like they can't be replaced. Just buy yourself some new ones when we get our payment. That brought a genuine smile to the other man's face. You know what? I think I will do just that. At the very least, they're much more pleasant to look at than the face of the boss. I mean, is it really too much to ask for that he doesn't scowl like we have pissed in his drink when he talks to us? The conversation started to digress from there, but Kiba had heard enough. Once he was sure they wouldn't speak any more about this mysterious boss of theirs or the attack that he now knew had clearly been staged, he rushed off to find Shino, his heart beating wildly in his chest. This kind of underhand plot was exactly what he had hoped for in a mission. Wheels within wheels and secrets within secrets, the excitement that shot through his veins at the thought of what would happen next would have made it impossible for him to sit still even if he tried. Even the exhaustion that had slowly accumulated from all the running he had done since departing from Hinata and Ataka-sensei was all but forgotten. He wondered if Shino had found something out as well. Who knows? Maybe there was even more to this entire situation than what he had heard already. The thought of that possibility didn't help calm him down at all. All he and Shino needed to do now was to return to their team's side, inform them of what they had found, and then take care of the problem. What exactly that would entail, he didn't know, but it would surely be amazing. After all, if there was some secret boss pulling the strings in the background, they needed to be found and captured, right? Kiba could hardly wait. Chapter 58, Kabasawa Mines 4. Let's start this from the beginning. Kabasawa Mines 4. This wasn't part of our agreement. A sitting figure tilted their head in agreement, not intimidated in the slightest by the accusing voice of the person in front of them. It was not, no. Regardless, I have already made arrangements to use the situation to our advantage, so there is no need for you to worry. The first person, a bulky man of large stature, scoffed in disbelief as he crossed his arms in front of his muscular chest, his long white hair swaying in the wind. Or so you say. It is we who have to face them if something goes wrong, though, so forgive me for not simply taking your word for it. I wasn't aware that you were so scared of a bunch of children, Guzen-san, the sitting figure replied, their voice taunting. If you don't think you can handle them, please feel free to step back from our contract. They then chuckled. Of course, if you chose to do so, you will obviously not get your money either. I heard that missing nins such as you depend on your reputations, though, so you might want to keep that in mind when you decide whether you take your leave or not. I don't give a damn about the children. It's their sensei that worries me. There are 3 of you against the 1 of him. I will be bold and say that the odds aren't in his favor. That's dash. Oh, Kmin, a female voice interrupted Guzen before he had the chance to reply. It's really unattractive when men act all frightened like this, you know? You have such a nice body. Don't ruin it by acting like a scaredy cat. Guzen spun around with a scowl on his face that was enhanced even further by the angry scar that ran from his left temple all the way over his eye and lips down to his chin. You of all people should keep your mouth shut. Isn't it you who's always the first to run away when we come across some dangerous opponent, Yawaku? Who always hides behind our backs at the first sign of danger. I don't know why we even bother to keep you around considering all you ever do is run away. Rather than being offended, the woman just giggled from her position on the low branch of a nearby tree as she played with a strand of her shoulder-length orange hair while crossing one leg over, her scanty shorts being barely enough to protect her dignity. You keep me around because I am useful, she said with a cheeky grin. Unlike certain other people whom I shall not name, that is. If there's something you have to say, just say it. Don't be shy. I would love nothing more than giving you a little lesson in humility. Oh? Do I really need to be even more obvious about it for you to understand? Women want men that can read between the lines, Guzen. No wonder you're still single. Guzen took a threatening step in her direction, but before things could escalate further, a new voice spoke up. Guzen, Yawaku, that's enough. I'm not in the mood to entertain your behavior right now. Either act appropriate or get lost. They stiffened at that, and almost as if a switch had been flipped, both straightened up and murmured some excuses and promises to be better. If one looked closely enough, one would even be able to see the fear in their eyes when they looked at that third person. Contrary to them, the sitting person chuckled, evidently not being scared at all but amused instead. Thank you, Heiken-san, they said. As entertaining as this was, I don't have all night, so there's no time to waste. Heiken, a tall and lean man with short brown hair and a sword strapped on his back, didn't acknowledge the words of gratitude and instead went straight back to business. You said you took measures to turn the situation to our advantage. Explain. Demanding, aren't you? The other person said, the amusement in their voice standing in stark contrast to the displeasure on their face. Nonetheless, that's none of your concern. All you need to know to do your job is that these Konohanins won't be a problem for much longer. While he didn't give any outward signs, the air around Heiken shifted, making it clear that he was not impressed by that reply. Fighting Itachi Uchiha wasn't part of our contract. We will need a bit more than your reassurance. Don't tell me that you're afraid of him as well. On the tree, Yawaka opened her mouth to give another sarcastic comment before thinking better of it and closing it again. The agreed-upon payment is not profitable enough to warrant the risk of fighting such a dangerous opponent. Either we renegotiate for more appropriate payment, or we will consider the contract void. For the first time, the face of the sitting person twisted from mere displeasure into something akin to anger. However, less than a second later, their expression smoothed out again, leaving no trace of their previous irritation behind. Fortunately, there won't be any need for that as you won't have to fight him at all. Heiken's eyes narrowed, and at the silent prompting, the other figure continued. There is no use in keeping these Konohanins here any longer. It's time for them to go. And how do you think to make that happen? Simple. I say we should give them a hand and let them finish the mission they have come for, shouldn't we? Then, in the glow of the full moon and surrounded only by the cawing of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind, they explained their plan. I see, Itachi said with a thoughtful expression on his face, looking back and forth between his two students in front of him. Well done, you two. This information shines a completely new light on the matter. Shino and Kiba glowed at that, though the latter was a bit more obvious about it. Even their apparent exhaustion wasn't enough to hamper their pride in their success. That being said, they were clearly somewhat distracted by his and Hinata's appearances, more so the latter's than his own, though. Their host still insisted on making their stay as comfortable as possible, and apparently, that included not letting them move around in anything but the finest clothes money could buy. Wealthy or not, all of them were from ninja clans and consequently clad in more practical clothes even if they could afford better, and even the formal robes they might possess weren't anything to what Akihito made available to them. Judging from the almost imperceptible but very much present blush on their faces whenever they glanced at Hinata, it made quite an impression. However, even that didn't stop Kiba from leaning forward with an excited gleam in his eyes when he heard Itachi's praise. So what does this mean? Are we going back and arrest them? Interrogate them? Itachi's lips twitched. No, I'm afraid we won't. But just as you have investigated the trail that led to these merchants, Hinata and I have investigated the situation here on site. Don't jump onto some course of action before you know the full picture. If you have the chance to think things through and consider your options, take the time to do it. It will be beneficial in the long run. Yes, Sensei, Kiba and Shino muttered obediently, and while the former was much more open about his disappointment, even Shino's shoulders slacked a bit after hearing his words. Don't act so dejected, he told them, deciding it would be unwise for their development to let them sulk in such negative emotions after what was essentially their first real success in the field. I didn't lie when I said that your intel is useful. In fact, it already raises a question about something we thought we knew that is now being challenged. That did the job, and two pairs of eager eyes were immediately focused on him. Really? Kiba said, his enthusiasm returning at once. What is it? Rather than answering himself, Itachi turned towards Hinata to his left, silently motioning for her to answer. To her credit, she overcame her surprise in an instant and immediately thought about all she knew to find what exactly it was he had been referring to. It took only a few seconds for her to make the connection. Didn't a number of survivors manage to get back here with over a dozen corpses in tow before we even arrived here? That's impossible, Shino immediately objected. For all its destruction, there was no sign of anyone being injured, much less killed. Furthermore, it shouldn't be possible for them to cover the distance from the scene of the attack to the mansion in such a short amount of time when even we need a bit over a day to do it while running. But they did return, Hinata insisted, although she clearly found it just as confusing as her teammate. They even had a funeral and, her voice drifted off as she clearly came to some kind of conclusion, and Itachi felt a surge of satisfaction when she activated her Byakugan, proving that she had realized exactly what he hoped she would. Just a moment after activating her dojutsu, her eyes widened. There are no bodies in any of the graves. What? Kiba exclaimed in surprise. But there are only piles of mud and puddles of water, but not a single human body. That means clones, Shino said, catching on quickly. There haven't been any casualties after all. The so-called survivors must be part of whatever ploy is going on. There shouldn't be anyone capable of ninjutsu, though, Kiba added with a frown. None of the people we saw had strong enough chakra to be a shinobi, I'm sure of that. Which means they must have collaborators. Now it was Hinata's turn to frown. To organize something with so many people involved without anyone noticing, whoever is behind this must have a lot of legitimate influence behind which they can hide their more illicit actions to avoid attracting attention. Watching them act like this made it almost hard to believe that they had still been in the academy not too long ago. They have truly come a far way already, Itaka thought. Regardless, it was here that he would take over. I agree, he interrupted the ongoing conversation. There is going something on behind the scenes, and it clearly involves someone influential with a lot of power who probably also collaborates with missing nins if what Hinata said about the empty graves is any indication. Consequently, this is no longer a simply C-rank mission and thus technically beyond our jurisdiction. He held up his hand to stop the 3 incoming complaints in their tracks. Note that I said technically. Hearing that, the 3 of them briefly relaxed before suddenly realizing what exactly the new situation and the presence of missing nins might entail for them, making them tense up again in a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Unfortunately, as much as I would like to abort the mission and leave another, more suited team to investigate this, I have a feeling that it might be too late for them to do anything by the time they arrive here. Because of that, I have concluded that the best approach would be to carefully look into the situation a bit more before ultimately deciding whether to leave this to others or not. That wasn't quite right, of course. With the mines being so close to the borders, it wouldn't be too hard to send a message to one of the Umbu teams that patrol there. They would probably be here within less than half a day if they took even that long. However, while he didn't have all the details, Itaka did have a pretty good idea of what was going on by now due to his own investigations and thought this would serve as both a good lesson as well as a test for his team. That didn't mean he would just risk their safety, of course. Even if he thought he knew enough to make this decision, there was no guarantee that it actually was the case, and he might be wrong about some details and consequently put them in danger. That, he couldn't allow. I should send the message anyway, he decided. There is no harm in having some Umbu on site in case something goes wrong, after all. They should agree to stay out of it unless necessary if he asked them to as well anyway. They and the clones he would let trail all 3 of his students should be more than enough to guarantee their safety even if something went wrong. Hinata, Itaka continued, not letting any of his thoughts show on his face. According to what we have been told, there should still be 3 survivors from the group that returned be present here. I want you to track them down and find out whatever you can. You may even approach them directly if you think that might help. She straightened up, practically radiating determination. Yes, sensei. He knew she was still disappointed with her own inattention during their welcome with Akihito, the meager amount of information they had found in the manor since then not helping her get over it either. The fact that her teammates had been so successful in the meantime probably made things even worse. She clearly wanted to use this opportunity to make up for what she perceived as her failure. Shino, Kiba, he turned towards his other 2 students, and Itaka almost felt bad about having to crush their hopeful expressions. You 2 will rest for now. But sensei dash. That is dash. Regardless of what's going to happen, he interrupted them both, suppressing his amused smile in favor of a stern look. You will need to be at your best to be up to it. If you're tired and exhausted, you won't be any use to anyone. You know that. Neither was happy about it, but it was a testament to just how tired they truly were that they didn't argue any further. The only reason they were still as energetic as they were was probably the excitement at all the new revelations they had just heard. Once they were in bed and had the chance to relax, they would most likely fall asleep within minutes and not wake up for many hours to come. Seeing that they didn't put up a fight, he allowed himself a small smile as he continued. First, however, we will need to introduce you 2 to Akihito Dano. He will want to hear what you have to say, too. Things are getting interesting, aren't they? Maybe I should have put on my normal clothes first. The people of the town were clearly well off, but Hinata's current attire still stood out in the masses. While not quite as elaborate as the kimono she wore during the feast, it was still clearly expensive and of high quality, not to mention that it was also quite different in style from anything the people around her wore. After all, white robes with red lining on the collar and sleeves, a pair of red hakama, and straw sandals were a quite unusual sight. Outside of temples, that is, she mentally amended while trying to ignore the eyes on her and avoid playing with the hems of her robes. With this outfit, you could almost mistake me for a Shinto priestess. She couldn't let that distract her from her current task, however. As soon as Itaka-sensei took his leave with Shino and Kiba to report to their client, Hinata had done as she was told and went looking for the so-called survivors. This was her chance to prove herself and she wasn't going to waste it. Not after both her teammates had been so successful in finding important intel. It wasn't that she begrudged them their success or anything like that. She didn't. It would have been a lie to say she hadn't been a bit disappointed that she had done little more than uselessly sitting around while they tracked down a budding conspiracy, though. So, while she was admittedly nervous about the entire situation and unsure about what to expect from these people she was looking for, she was determined to do as she was told and find out as much as she could. She would not be left behind by her team. Unfortunately, things quickly became more complicated when it turned out that the men she was looking for didn't currently reside in the manor like most relatives of the victims of the attack, victims that, according to Shino and Kiba, didn't exist. They had apparently not been present for the feast a few days ago either. Tracking them down had taken the better part of the day and had ultimately been as much a matter of luck as it had been of her skills. After hunting down scribe after scribe, running from one office to the next, and simply asking random guards and maids if they knew anything, it was only because she found a servant who had a friend who knew someone that had helped organize the funeral that she found a lead. A lead that led her to a small inn at the edge of the town. Thus, here she was, walking down the streets with the setting sun to her right while trying to avoid the stares of curious onlookers. I should try to move into a side alley before continuing over the rooftops, she mused with a thoughtful frown. At least when I'm a bit closer. Otherwise, I will be spotted immediately. While the added benefit of not having to deal with being watched from every direction was nice, the main reason was indeed that she wanted to spy on her targets from afar first before potentially approaching them. While her Byakugan meant that she didn't need to get as close for that as others would, it would still be a problem if other people saw her doing it. After all, you never knew who they were. Who she thought was a random bystander might actually turn out to be an enemy. That thought made her pause. Now that she thought about it, how could she know that she wasn't being watched right now? With so many eyes on her, she wouldn't be able to identify an enemy unless they were stupid enough to leak some bloodlust, so there might very well be someone involved in whatever plot was going on observing her at this very moment with her being none the wiser. It took all the self-control she had to not nervously look around and possibly give her suspicion away. Instead, she continued on as normal until she found what she was looking for, approaching the first food stall she could find to buy some takoyaki. It wouldn't be too strange for her to go and explore the town after being stuck in the mansion for days with nothing to do, right? To go among people, look around, and enjoy some good food should almost be expected in that situation, or at least that was what Hinata hoped any possible pursuer who was watching her would be thinking. At least my outfit means nobody in their right mind would ever suspect I was trying to do something sneaky. She kept that act up as she continued walking down the streets, her plan to use the rooftops all but forgotten. While it probably wouldn't be too suspicious for her to do that considering it wasn't uncommon for a kunoichi to use them when they were in a hurry, it might make a wrong impression, so that approach was out. It was for the same reason that she didn't use her Byakugan to scout out the area. Instead, she simply continued as she was until she was close enough to the inn that she would be able to observe the inside of it with her Byakugan. At that point, all that was left to do was to find a place from where she could do just that without being spotted or appearing suspicious. Thankfully, there was a tea house just at the corner of the street she was currently walking on. Within a few minutes, she had entered, placed an order, and found a seat at the back corner where no one could see her face. Hinata needed to sit with her back to the room for that to be the case, of course, but considering her vision wasn't limited by such silly things as the direction her eyes were facing, that was hardly a problem. She could easily spare some attention to keep aware of her surrounding while spying on her targets. As it turned out, however, there was one other problem she hadn't even considered until now. It took her just a couple of minutes to check every room of the inn, and while by some coincidence every single one of them was not only booked but currently occupied, none of them fit the descriptions she had been given. Hell, only about half a dozen of the guests were around the right age. And of them, none fit the other criteria like hairstyle, skin color, or even gender. Hinata was absolutely sure that this was the inn the clerk who had helped organize the funeral had been speaking of. She had even seen its address on the invite to the funeral herself. There was no way that she was wrong. Which, in turn, meant that something else was very, very wrong instead. She broke out in a cold sweat as a shiver ran down her spine. Sure, it technically could be an easy misunderstanding, but with everything else going on in the background, even something innocent like this suddenly appeared quite sinister to her. What if the clerk she had thought was only helping her was actually part of this conspiracy? What if whoever was behind all of this had grown tired of her team's presence and decided to take care of them? Separated from the rest of her team and far away from any potential aid as she was, Hinata would be in a prime position for an ambush. Some part of her brain recognized that she was probably overthinking this, but she couldn't help it. Besides, Itaka-sensei had taught them to trust their guts, and right now, it was telling her that something about the situation was not right. The only reason she could keep up even a modicum of composure was that her Byakugan gave her a perfect view of anything around her. No matter what her instincts might be telling her, at least for now, she could be confident that she was safe. No one had entered the tea house since she did, and no one was loitering around on the streets around it, so there was probably no pursuer after her right now. I should go back to the mansion and report to Sensei, she thought, the idea of returning without any meaningful result suddenly not sounding as terrible as it would have only a little while ago. He will want to know that our targets aren't where they were supposed to be. Unfortunately, it was just when she was about to put some money on the table for the drink that hadn't even arrived yet that the screaming started. For about half a second, Hinata didn't even realize what it was, frowning in confusion at the shrill sound that was barely audible over the murmured conversations around her. She seemed to be the only one who noticed them, too. Then, at the exact moment she realized what it was she was hearing, a booming explosion drowned out everything else, and the screams that followed shortly after would have been impossible to miss. Hinata was the first one out of the building, and a moment later, she stood on the highest roof in the area to see what was going on. She didn't expect to see plumes of smoke rising into the sky while several giant boars tore through buildings as if they were made from paper and not actually sturdy stone constructions. They were a considerable distance away, explaining why she hadn't noticed them earlier with her Byakugan, as they were simply outside her range, but even that didn't stop the screams from getting louder and louder as the people around began to realize what was going on, or, in some cases, they realized that something was going on but had no idea what exactly it was while getting infected with the panic all around them. In what felt like hours but was probably less than a minute, there was chaos in the streets below her as people began to run in every direction to get away to safety as fast as possible. Meanwhile, Hinata remained rooted on the roof, frozen in place and unable to move. All she could do was watch with growing horror as the smoke plumes grew bigger in both size and number while the screams were slowly replaced by ringing in her ears. Her mind was blank. Then, without even realizing it herself at first, she began to run straight towards the source of it all. She couldn't run back to get her team. That would take way too long. By the time they returned, at least half the town would be in shambles, and who knew how many would be dead. Turning her back and letting that happen simply wasn't an option. Besides, these were only boars. Big ones, yes, but still nothing more than wild animals. While it wouldn't do to underestimate them, Hinata didn't think they were too much of a threat. Certainly nothing she couldn't handle. That there were apparently 6 of them was somewhat of a problem, but they were different from human opponents in that they wouldn't really be able to cooperate against her, so their numbers hardly even mattered. The only problem was that the others could cause more chaos while she was busy with one of them. It was only much later Hinata would realize that she felt perfectly calm as she rushed towards the boars. Just like during that short period in her fight against Lee, all her worries vanished in the back of her head while she focused on what lay ahead, nothing but her goal mattering whatsoever. The boars were currently roughly split into 3 groups. There was one of them straight ahead of her, 3 of them running through the streets a bit further behind that one, and 2 more even further away. Logically, being the one closest to her, It was the single one she reached first. Now, boars had a thick hide, and giant ones even more so. Consequently, even though they technically had tenketsu she could target just like any other living being, it was unlikely to be effective. At the very least, she didn't think she could close them with a single strike, and even if she did, they wouldn't go down from just that. No, she needed to do something else. They had weak spots, of course. Their eyes, for example, were just as vulnerable as everyone else's. If she could hit them with a kunai, it would certainly be effective. It would also enrage them and throw them into a frenzy if her throw wasn't powerful enough to also pierce their brain. Also, there was no guarantee that she would even hit her target in the first place. She wasn't bad at shurikenjutsu, and Ataka-sensei had trained to hit moving targets with them, but it definitively wasn't her speciality. No, the odds of her missing and consequently endangering the citizens around her by making the boar angrier and even more violent weren't zero and thus too high. Fortunately, Hinata had another way to take care of the boar. Increasing her speed some more, she reached her first target with half a dozen more leaps before overtaking it with one more. Within moments, she was ahead of it, and she only stopped when she judged the distance sufficient, coincidentally coming to a halt right in front of a pair of children that couldn't be older than 4 or 5. Hinata ignored them, however, their surprised yelps not even registering to her. Instead, she reached into her weapon pouch and her hand came back empty. It took only half a second for her to remember that she didn't bring her weapons with her. What a stupid mistake. Because her pouch had been unsuited for her current attire. Hinata didn't let that slow her down, though. Now was not the time to get angry about stupid and totally avoidable mistakes. Necessity breeds creativity, after all, so it was on a whim that she grabbed a 4-arm-long metal rod from the ground and began infusing chakra into it, very much intending to use it as a replacement for her weapons. It was certainly not as good a catalyst as forged weapons, and it would probably be unusable after one use even if she could retrieve the weapon after using it, but that hardly mattered. As long as it got the job done, it would have served its purpose. Small cracks were forming on the rod, the pressure of her chakra proving to be too much for it, but Hinata was confident that it would endure long enough for this one attack. More important than that, however, was the fact that small flashes of lightning flickered alongside the blue glow of her chakra, twitching across her hand with increasing intensity. Normally thrown weapons might not pierce the boar's thick hide, but something enhanced by lightning chakra, even if it was technically blunt, on the other hand. Even if she missed its eyes, with this, it would be a killing blow as long as she hit the head. And with that thought, she threw the rod. There was a crackling sound as the weapon flew through the air, leaving a blue trail in its wake as it closed the distance between itself and its target in an instant, before it made contact, piercing right through its forehead without slowing down in the slightest and coming out on the other side a moment later. The boar didn't even have time to groan before its legs gave way under it and it fell to the ground. Her attack had been a complete success. There was one small problem, though. When Hinata initially decided on a position from where to throw a weapon, she had included an estimate for how far the beast would slide over the ground after falling down. After all, it only made sense that it wouldn't come to a stop immediately after she killed it considering it had been running at top speed. However, because she had forgotten her weapon pouch and had to improvise, her attack had been delayed for a few seconds. Naturally, the boar had used these few seconds to cross more distance between them than Hinata had initially calculated. This, in turn, meant that her estimate for where it would be safe to come to a stop was no longer accurate. The point she was trying to make was that the giant boar was currently still sliding towards her with great speed and wouldn't come to a halt before hitting her. It wasn't a big deal, of course. Hinata would be able to dodge something like that easily. That being said, the two children behind her would most definitively not be able to do the same. She had already tensed her muscles and channeled chakra into her legs in preparation to jump away when that particular realization struck her, and by then, it was almost too late. Hinata needed to abort her current course of action, drastically change her direction, cross the distance between herself and the children, and grab them to take them with her as she dodged. Ignoring her screaming muscles after having to redirect so suddenly and the similarly screaming children in her arms once she reached them, she drove to the side just in time to save all three of them from certain death, the sliding boar passing them by close enough for Hinata to feel its fur graze her feet. The three of them tumbled to the ground, and it was only Hinata who immediately rolled back into a crouch, even the presence of two clinging children not being enough to overcome the instincts that had been trained into her. With the children being safe and her first target eliminated, Hinata immediately prepared to move on, intending to get the other 5 beasts as well as fast as possible, only to come to an abrupt stop when her eyes fell on the trail of blood the giant boar had left in its wake, following it all the way to the building at the end of the street its corpse had crashed into. And with that, the calmness that had overtaken her mind as her instincts took over vanished, leaving Hinata once again in full control over her body. She had never killed before. It might be silly considering this wasn't even a person but a wild, mad beast, but the fact remained that this was the first time she had taken a life. This was what a kunoichi did, Hinata knew that, and she certainly didn't regret killing it when that was what it took to save the helpless citizens. She had told Itaka-sensei just a few weeks ago during their conversation after the training session with Team Guy that she was prepared to do her duty, too, but now she found it impossible not to be at least a little bit affected by what she had done. Thankfully, Hinata was quickly snapped out of these thoughts before she had a chance to really fall into a downward spiral. "Thank you, Nei-san," one of the 2 children, a boy, cried, clinging to her right arm while the other child, a girl, did the same with her other one. Jumping at the opportunity this distraction provided, she immediately focused on them. "It's okay," she said soothingly, unintentionally using the same tone she used whenever Hanabi came to her room after a nightmare. "Everything is going to be alright. You're safe now." "But I'm here, aren't I?" she interrupted the girl before she even had the chance to voice any doubts while simultaneously gently freeing herself from their grips, knowing full well that she couldn't let herself be delayed for long. "I will take care of these boars, okay? You just need to find an adult and ask for their help. Can you do that?" As much as she would have loved to stay with them for longer, Hinata only waited for long enough to see their uncertain nods before jumping back into action, heading straight for the boars that were running around in a group of 3. "I can't get distracted now," she thought, a determined scowl on her face. "These boars need to be taken care of as fast as possible. Hesitation will only get people killed." She might not be in the same state of mind as earlier, but she was focused nonetheless. That would have to be enough. The streets, while certainly spacious, were not designed to accommodate giant boars, so there was not enough space for 2 of them to run side by side, and Hinata meant to exploit that. As she was too far away to reach them quickly enough before they caught up the group of citizens ahead of them, she would need to stop them from afar, and for that, the limited space played perfectly into her hand. Hakukusho. 8 trigrams vacuum palm. A wave of compressed chakra shot from her outstretched palm and slammed into the flank of the boar at the front. Now, her vacuum palm wasn't as powerful as, say, Niji's, and it obviously would be even less effective against an enormous opponent like these boars than it would be against other humans. Actually beating them with that attack hadn't been her intention, however. Rather, she had merely wanted to stop them in their tracks, and that plan was a full success. While it clearly didn't do any meaningful harm, the attack had been strong and unexpected enough to throw its target off balance and topple it first against the walls of the house to its side and then to the ground. And as she had already mentioned, the street wasn't wide enough to accommodate more than 1 boar, so with the one that had been leading their charge lying on the ground and no way for the other 2 to either stop or run around it, they stomped all over it before they too fell to the ground. Not losing any time, Hinata grabbed the first 2 pieces of metallic wreckage she could find and began charging them with lightning chakra before throwing them at her targets. The first stone hit its mark without trouble, entering the first boar's forehead on one side and leaving it on the other a moment later. The second one, on the other hand, didn't. While her aim had technically been on spot, the fact that the 3 struggling beasts were lying on top of each other meant that they were also trying to push each other away in their efforts to get back to their feet. Unfortunately for her, that resulted in the third boar pushing the target of her second weapon out of the way, resulting in it missing its head and instead finding its way into its shoulder. That, in turn, made the boar squeak in pain while it lashed out even more. A moment later, it rammed into the house next to it, bringing the entire construct down on top of it. Hinata's eyes widened, a sense of panic spreading through her chest. If there had been people inside of it. A quick check with her Byakugan fortunately eased that concern easily enough. There were people in the neighboring buildings, however, staring with terror at the great beast in front of them through the newly formed holes in their walls. The third boar was already back to its feet and about to continue its rampage through the streets, but Hinata had no time to worry about that. The people the three beasts had been chasing earlier had had enough time to flee, so the ones right in front of the wounded one had priority right now. Without even realizing it, she rushed past the healthy one, not even sparing it a glance before appearing above the wounded boar that was just about to direct its anger against the people to its feet. Hakusho Kaiten. 8 trigrams, palm rotation. Spinning in the air, Hinata released chakra from all her tenketsu at once a mere moment before she crashed into the boar. Again, that attack alone wouldn't be enough to finish the boar for good, but it was more than enough to smash it into the ground with a pained grunt. That, in turn, put it into the perfect position for her follow-up attack. Hakusho. 8 trigrams vacuum palm. When she used the vacuum palm this time, Hinata made sure to use exceptionally more chakra than normal before directing the attack directly at the back of the boar's head. After all, it might not be enough to truly harm it in the traditional sense, but from such short range and with its head lying on the ground, it should certainly be sufficient. The crack that rang through the air a moment later as its skull broke proved her right. That wasn't any reason to rest, though. There were still 3 more boars running around and creating havoc. With every second that passed, more property was damaged and more people were injured and even killed. She needed to hurry if she wanted to. Hinata wasn't exactly sure what happened, but suddenly there was a flash above the boar that had been running away from her before it toppled over without so much as a grunt. Also, now that she thought about it, there was a distinctive lack of stomping and screaming in the distance. It probably took her a little longer than appropriate to recognize the figure looking down at her from the top of the freshly fallen boar. Sensei. Chapter 59, Kabasawa Mines v. Let's start this from the beginning. Kabasawa Mines v. Who would have thought they would unleash the boars on the town? This is much more daring of them than I anticipated. Itaki had known that something would happen, but for them to go this far was truly a surprise. It wasn't as if he didn't expect that the boars would make an appearance. If the culprits behind this conspiracy wanted them gone, arranging for them to kill the boars, the reason his team was here in the first place, wasn't a stupid plan. In theory, it would resolve the situation quite nicely. However, doing so in such a way seemed not only entirely unnecessary but outright counterproductive as well. The culprits surely wouldn't want to attract additional attention to the area while they were pulling off some kind of scheme, right? Something big like giant boars destroying parts of the town could easily convince the Hokage to station a number of shinobi here in order to avoid such incidents in the future, defying the entire point about getting Itaka's team to leave. Unless they have a way to influence who will be sent and thus can bring in possible allies, that is, he mused. Or, more likely, there are other factors at play that I don't know about. Sensei, someone spoke up from his right. What exactly are you looking for? Turning around, he came face to face with Hinata and Shino. When the boars attacked the town, Itake, Kiba, and Shino had still been at the manor, and while Itaka by himself would have been able to cross the distance and come to the town's aid relatively quickly, his 2 students most definitively would not. Especially considering they were supposed to be resting. That being said, Itaka too had only been able to set off after the attack had already started, meaning there would have been victims even in the short time it took him to arrive. Fortunately, however, Itaki had a clone follow Hinata in secret from the moment she left the mansion, allowing him to intervene almost immediately anyway. Thanks to both his and Hinata's efforts, the number of casualties kept below a dozen. By the time he and his other 2 students arrived, all the boars had already been taken care of. I was merely thinking, he answered Hinata's question. Don't you think it's strange that these boars attacked the town like this even though Kiba had been sure that they actually moved away from the area after the attack on the caravan? Both frowned at that. Right, Hinata said, that's weird. Also, isn't it really unusual for them to attack towns in general? It is, Shino agreed. Why? The loud noises of such a big settlement scare them off. It rarely happens that giant boars attack smaller villages, but never large towns like this one. This behavior is most unusual. They did seem unnaturally enraged as well. It would have been all but impossible to notice for someone who wasn't already familiar with him, but after hearing Hinata's murmured comment, Shino straightened, clearly coming to some kind of realization. Would it be possible that someone intentionally directed the animals to the town? In that case, especially if they were under attack, they would possibly not hesitate to enter even such a populated area. But why? Hinata stopped herself before she could finish that sentence, her eyes shining as she too realized what this would mean. They want us gone, don't they? If the boars attack the town, we would be bound to kill them, consequently finishing our mission and then taking our leave. And thus giving the culprits behind this conspiracy free rein to do as they please, Shino finished. How clever. Quite so, Itaki agreed, but while this certainly sounds very convincing, we have yet to prove it. Is that why you took Kiba with you to check where the boars came from, sensei? He nodded at the question. He who was with them here right now was, in fact, just a clone. Just as Shino had said, the original Itaki had taken Kiba with him to see where the boars had come from. It was technically unnecessary, of course. Their mission was to eliminate the boars, and with that done, there was no reason for them to do any further investigation. They were free to leave at any time now. However, with all the other things they had found out so far, it was only natural that accepting something far-stretched like the boars randomly attacking the town wasn't really an option. So, while it was unlikely that he would find anything, Itaka took Kiba to see if he could find traces of a scent of any of the people operating in the shadows. And even if that didn't happen, he was sure the Inyazuka would at the very least find something else to prove another of Itaka's suspicions. Exactly. We won't leave all the research to him alone, though. There's something I would like to test out for which your help is indispensable. He turned towards Shino while pointing at the nearby corpse of one of the boars Hinata had killed. Would you please direct your Kikaicho to suck all the remaining churka from its body? To his credit, Shino didn't hesitate at all to follow his instructions even though he was clearly confused about his intentions. While the boy was busy, he turned toward his other student. Hinata, can you tell me what you know about the summoning technique? Similarly to Shino, she seemed confused about that questions as well but answered nonetheless. We learned a bit about it at the academy. People can sign contracts with certain groups of animals to summon them in battle, although they're not actually required to fight for you. It's voluntary. She hesitated for a moment before continuing. I know that the sun and all have different summons, snakes, toads, and slugs respectively, and that you, of course, have a contract with crows, sensei. That were the basics, yes, but it didn't cover the part he wanted to get at. That's correct. A summoning contract allows you to summon whatever animal you have made a contract with, and the amount of chakra used determines the size, strength, and number of animals that are summoned. If too little chakra is offered, only a small, young animal will be summoned. By offering large amounts of chakra, multiple adult animals can be summoned simultaneously. Animals aren't summoned indefinitely, however, and they will return to wherever they were summoned from when they tire out or enough time has passed. That being said, they usually don't immediately return when they're killed. That only happens if the time of their death coincidentally happens to overlap with the time their chakra runs out. As a rule, the summoning can theoretically last as long as the animal still possesses enough chakra. Just as in humans, certain bodily functions continue for a little while longer even after a person's clinical death. The same is true for chakra. As long as their reserves weren't empty at the time of their death, a person will still have some remaining chakra in their bodies for some time. My father once told me the same thing, Shino said. That's how secret techniques are stolen. Enemy shinobi take the corpse, preserve its chakra, and then research their bodies to find out how their techniques work. Hinata's face briefly distorted in a grimace before she caught herself. My clan's caged bird seal activates upon the death of its carrier to permanently destroy their Byakugan and stop it from falling into enemy hands to avoid just that. Our Kikaichu are instructed to destroy our internal pathways and suck us dry of chakra if we die for the same reason. Shino said that without so much as a frown and his voice was steady and calm, but Itaka could see beneath that. He was clearly just as uncomfortable with that topic as Hinata even if he was better at hiding it. Not that Itaka could blame either of them, of course. As much as death was a constant companion for shinobi, It wasn't exactly an easy topic for young and inexperienced ones to talk or even think about. Talking about what happened to their bodies after their death was bound to be uncomfortable. And with this information, why do you think I instructed you to extract the boar's chakra? Itaki asked, bringing the conversation back on topic and effectively distracting them from their dark thoughts. Both seemed to come to a conclusion at the same time, but Hinata was quicker to speak up. You think the boars were summons? That was the most obvious conclusion given their prior conversation, and she certainly wasn't wrong about Itaki having at least considered that possibility, but it wasn't like he really believed in it. His own suspicions weren't too different, however, and actually related to the topic of summons, so this had been as good an opportunity as any to give them a brief excursus on the subject. There's no chakra left, Shino then announced while the insects he had used to drain the corpse of its chakra flew back towards him in swarms. The boar's body remained in their wake, its chakra completely depleted and yet not vanishing in a puff of smoke. Hence, this theory is proven false. Hinata, Itaka said before either of them could be too disappointed about this supposedly false lead, please check if you can see some kind of seal inside its body. Again, regardless of whatever confusion she might feel, she didn't hesitate in doing as he asked. It took only a little more than 10 seconds for her to find what she was looking for. There is, she uncharacteristically exclaimed. It's right on its heart. I don't know what it means, but it's definitively there. Then, a bit softer, I have never seen anything like that. Shino, on the other hand, threw him a suspicious look. You knew about this, didn't you, sensei? It was only a hunch, although I have to admit I was indeed confident it would turn out like this, yes. Then, seeing the unspoken questions in both his students' eyes, he continued, while a summoning technique using a contract summons an animal that has voluntarily allied itself with you, it is possible to forcefully summon one by placing a seal on it. That's obviously not very effective when one wants to cooperate with the summoned animal, but when it comes to wild animals like these boars whose only suppose is to rage and cause chaos, it does its job just fine. Itaka didn't think it essential to mention that in theory, one could also summon intelligent animals and even biju and then simply control them with a suitably powerful genjutsu to make use of them that way. In this case, Kiba's statements that there are no traces of the boars in the area and that they seem to have moved away from here after attacking the caravan, combined with the fact that giant boars are not normally found in this part of the country, led me to suspect that a summoning might be the cause. It's only now that I have proof, though. There were a few seconds of silence. Then, so there are definitively shinobi involved, huh? Shino nodded at Hinata's words, his face grave. So it seems. This, too, wasn't much of a surprise. Some of the things Itaki had found in his investigation had, while not outright proven their existence, clearly pointed towards it being the case. Now the only questions remaining were who and how capable they are. Itaka would decide on the details of his next steps depending on the answers to that. At least finding the answers shouldn't be too hard. While he hadn't known for sure, he did consider the possibility of shinobi being involved and had taken steps to prepare for it just in case. While he might not have found them yet, he had scouted the area and looked for possible hideouts, and the fact that he hadn't stumbled over them yet meant he could narrow their location down by excluding the places he had already checked. Yes, finding them shouldn't be too much of a task if he actually searched for them instead of merely keeping an eye out while focusing primarily on other things. So what are we going to do now? Itaka pulled himself out of his thoughts before giving first Hinata and then Shino a reassuring smile. Now, we prepare to depart. Our mission is finished, after all. Their flabbergasted looks made it absolutely worth it to have phrased that so misleadingly. Can we go, please? I want to see the flowers. Hinata gave the younger girl a gentle smile that hid the unease she actually felt before giving her consent, resulting in a gleeful squeal from the girl. Nizu, just like her father, here at Akihito, was not what one would typically expect from a noble. Especially not from a noble whose family controlled the region with the most important mines in the country and accordingly much influence. On the other hand, she thought with a hum, maybe it's the fact that they have so much power that allows them to step out of line and act as they do. When Hinata had been 9 years old, her days had been spent training both her fighting abilities and social skills that were expected of the Hyuga heiress. While it wasn't as if she had no free time at all, she had been very busy, devoting many hours every week to her duties. From what she had heard from her teammates and the general gossip back at the academy, the other children that belonged to clans and the heirs in particular didn't have it much different. Nizu, on the other hand, spent most of her time playing, fooling around, and generally making the lives of her caretakers much more complicated than they had any right to be. The 9-year-old simply loved dashing through flower beads, completely uncaring of the mud that covered her expensive robes or the way her shoulder-length hair stood up in all directions afterwards, and even tried to hide from her caretakers just to see how long they would need to find her on more than one occasion. Even worse, her father never reprimanded her. Now, Hinata was the last person to complain about a father doting on their daughter, but in her opinion, there was a difference between encouraging one's child on one hand and letting them do as they pleased on the other. This was clearly the latter. Still, Hinata could help but like the girl. In a way, she reminded her of Hanabi. Although her sister was much better behaved and could act like a proper Hyaga if the situation demanded it, she had a mischief strike a mile long and loved nothing more than causing Hinata trouble in the same way Nizu caused trouble for her caretakers. One of which was currently Hinata. 1 week had passed since the boars attacked the town, and 6 days since she and her team had officially departed to head home. Unofficially, however, they had only traveled for about an hour before turning around to go back. In accordance with whatever Itaka-sensei had agreed upon with their client, Hinata had then been welcomed back into the mansion as a freshly employed maid and caretaker for Nizu. Obviously not as herself, though. No, before she set foot through the gates again, she underwent a transformation in the truest sense of the word, from new clothes fitting for her current occupation, a new hairstyle, a generous amount of makeup, and even contact lenses to hide her pupilless eyes. Every possible step had been taken to make her unrecognizable to anyone who might have seen her before. It was a surreal experience, really. Even she couldn't recognize herself in the mirror anymore. Thanks to all the work that went into her appearance, she now looked a few years older than she was, passing as an older teen rather than a 12-year-old, even though her height still caused a few raised eyebrows. She could have used a henge, of course, but considering their tentative plans meant she might play this role for up to 10 days before they reconsidered and thought about how to proceed in case nothing of note happened in that time. Doing so was out of the question. Even ignoring the problem of the constant drain on her chakra, it was much too risky to use it considering the transformation was relatively easy to break. Especially with an energetic child like Nizu around. Thus, here she was, playing at being her maid. Hinata had been unsure about this at first. After all, wouldn't it be suspicious if a new maid appeared shortly after their team had left? However, it seemed that worry had been unnecessary as the girl's behavior meant new caretakers came and went in almost a daily manner, meaning nobody looked at her twice when she arrived. What caught people's attention, on the other hand, was that she could actually handle Nizu. Maybe it was her experience with Hanabi that allowed her to deal with her, maybe it was because she had met the girl before and consequently already knew what to expect rather than being caught flat-footed by her attitude. Or maybe it was simply that she could afford to be just a little bit sterner with her than the normal caretakers, but for some reason, Nizu actually listened to her. Not always and not necessarily to the letter, but at the end of the day, even that was more than anyone else had managed so far. Which was exactly why she had been promoted to the girl's primary caretaker within 2 days of her stay. Hinata was sure that this had nothing to do with Hirata Akihito knowing her true identity or the fact that he knew she was actually here to protect his daughter. Nothing at all. That was the crux of the entire situation. With all the suspicious activities they had uncovered during their stay, Itaka-sensei thought it likely that something was going to happen soon. Maybe even as soon as they had left and put enough distance between themselves and the mines to avoid them becoming aware of what was going on. Obviously, if someone was trying to make some shady moves in the area, they needed to take care of the people in charge. Killing them would cause more problems than it would solve, though. So rather than disposing of Akihito, it made much more sense to manipulate and control him. And what better way to do so than threatening the daughter he so obviously adored, right? So, while the rest of her team was doing their own part to prepare for a potential confrontation with enemy shinobi, Hinata was playing caretaker aka bodyguard for Nizu. She had been rather anxious at first, the idea of having to fight real enemies, possibly even missing nins. On her first mission outside the village, which had been supposed to be an easy one, honestly frightening her, but the constant frenzy of trying to keep up with her charge quickly distracted her of all that. By now, even though she obviously still kept aware of her surroundings just like she had been taught, Hinata actually. She wasn't even aware of what she was doing, but one moment she was following after Nizu towards the outskirts of the property close to the walls, and the next moment she was jumping into action to push the two other maids and the one guard that were also part of their group to the ground to avoid them being hit by something. Half a second later, some kind of yellow flash flew past them by a hair before vanishing in the distance. What was that? Are we under attack? What the dash? Hinata ignored the confused exclamations around her as she jumped back to her feet, instantly falling into her familiar fighting stance while desperately trying to ignore the panic that was building up in her chest. She didn't even think about taking out her contact lenses before she did it, but even the relief of finally being rid of them didn't help calm her down. Still, while they might not have prevented her from using her Byakugan, they would certainly have made it more uncomfortable, so at least that was one thing less she had to worry about. Oh my, isn't that a nice surprise? I thought you Konohanins had left days ago? That's what I have been told, at least. Mind telling me why you're still here, sweetie? I doubt you had a change of heart and decided that the life of a maid would be preferable to that of a kunoichi, did ya? The person had spoken up at the exact same moment Hinata had noticed her. It was a beautiful woman with orange, shoulder-length hair that wore a red, sleeveless blouse and a pair of scandalous short shorts, sitting on the wall with her legs crossed and looking down at them. What truly caught Hinata's attention, however, was the headband she wore around her waist like a belt. Or, more precisely, the scratch that went through the symbol of Tsunagakuer on it. She's a missing nin, Hinata realized, feeling her blood running cold. Hinata. Nizu spoke up from behind her, and thanks to her Byakugan, Hinata didn't even need to turn around to see her wide, fearful eyes. Why are you dash? You need to go, she interrupted her, trying to sound braver than she felt. That's a criminal. It's dangerous here. I will take care of her, so please run back to the mansion and call for help. If Ataka-sensei wasn't close enough to notice what was going on, that should notify him. But dash. Now, Nizu-chan. While it was the girl she addressed, it was the lone guard that reacted first, grabbing the girl and lifting her onto his shoulders to her vocal protests before starting to run away, quickly followed by the two maids. The enemy kunoichi wouldn't let them go just like this, though. Oh, you want to stop me? How cute. Let's see how you are going to do that, shall we? Hinata wasn't sure what it was that she was doing, but she did notice that the other woman began gathering chakra into her right hand, and it was that what allowed her to act in a timely manner. Pushing herself off the ground, she rushed to stand between the fleeing figures and the other kunoichi even as her body felt numb with fear, coming to a stop at the same time as her opponent lazily raised one of her hands to make a single hand seal. A second later, 3 flashes that seemed to be made of dazzling bright chakra shot out of the open palm of her hand, heading straight towards Nizu and her entourage with only Hinata in between to stop them. In some strange way, this was reassuring. While it certainly did nothing to calm her down, this was familiar. This was something she knew to handle. 3 projectiles were nothing. Compared to what she had dealt with during training, this could practically be considered child's play. Gathering chakra into her hands, she aimed right at the attacks. With the gentle fist, it was laughable easy to cut through constructs made of chakra, so while Hinata didn't know what kind of technique the kunoichi was using exactly, the fact that the projectiles were definitively made of chakra was more than enough to assure her of the effectiveness of her approach. 3 quick palm strikes later, the attack had been stopped in its tracks, allowing the group behind her to escape unhindered. Hinata's hands felt surprisingly warm, though. However, considering it wasn't even to the point where it was uncomfortable, she ignored that for the moment and instead focused on her opponent. She had clearly succeeded in her objective, meaning she should feel some sense of accomplishment, but the smirk on the other woman's face gave her pause. Shouldn't she be bothered by her failure? Angry, even? Why did it look like she didn't care at all? You're really something, aren't you? Cutting through my attack like it's nothing even though I put a bit more chakra into it than usual. I have been warned about Hyuga being able to do that, you know, but it's something else entirely to see it with my own eyes. You have been warned about it. Hinata jumped at the chance to occupy her mind with something else than her wildly beating heart. Is it because they knew we were here or? Of course, the woman said with an amused giggle while rearranging her legs. Everyone in my family is warned about yours, just as everyone is told how to exploit your weaknesses. Hinata's eyes widened. What does she mean with? Well, I guess I really should go after that brat, shouldn't I? My boss will be pissed if I return without her. Then, her lips curled into a cruel smirk, twisting her beautiful face into something much more sinister. On the other hand, I never had the opportunity to fight a Hyuga. Why see, I wanted to fight someone from your clan for years but was never lucky enough to encounter one. Now, with you right in front of me, how could I possibly resist? You're really cute too, so there's no way I'm letting you go. I can find that girl after I have dealt with you anyway, so I should not even get into trouble for this. A small part of her thought that this might be a good thing. If the woman was so fixated on her that she wouldn't even try to go after Nizu, doing her job would be much, much easier. On the other hand, Hinata really didn't like what she was saying. While she had no idea why that woman's family was so focused on her clan that they deliberately informed every one of their members about their abilities and weaknesses, it couldn't possibly mean anything good for her. Quite the opposite, in fact. I can't let this unsettle me, she told herself, thinking that just as much as a reminder of one of the basic rules they had been taught at the academy is to encourage herself. I need to keep a clear head. If I panic, I lose. Remember what Sensei had told us right after we became his students, nobody is perfect. Nobody is unbeatable. Whoever saw through their opponent and found their flaws first would win. Even if she's stronger than I am, I can still win if I find even just one nick in her technique. Technically, Hinata was already at a disadvantage because her opponent clearly knew about her abilities and weaknesses, but she could turn that into an advantage as well. After all, she knew her opponent knew the typical Hyuga fighting style, so she had really no reason whatsoever to rely solely on that. If she could take the other Kunoichi by surprise with that approach, the fight could be over before she even knew it. In theory, that sounded actually quite nice. It was unfortunate that it did little to reassure her, though. She was scared. Hinata had no problem admitting that. She was sweating bullets, her heart was beating wildly in her chest, and it was only the self-control instilled in her since she was a little child that kept her from trembling or clenching her hands into fists. However, she couldn't back down. She wouldn't. After all, not only did she have a duty as Kunoichi to see her mission to the end, but there was also someone she had to protect. Someone who relied on her. For one moment, Nizu's face in her mind was replaced by Hanabi's before she shook that image off again. I can't fail, Hinata thought while summoning every ounce of determination she could find within her. Sensei wouldn't have trusted me to do this if he didn't think I could do it. Even if I don't believe in myself, I need to at least trust that he wouldn't have put me into this position without reason. She might be scared, terrified even, but she wouldn't back down. She would prove that she was worth being not only a Kunoichi but also a Taka's student and her father's daughter. She wouldn't let her team down. The excitement of spying on Mikata, the captain of their client's guards, had worn off quickly, Shino thought. Finding the man had been relatively easy as all they needed to do was follow the tracks the man's group had left behind. Considering they had left the town with a large group of horses and carts that left deep imprints in the ground, they hadn't even needed Kibis and Akamaru's noses to do so. At first, both Shino and his teammate had been more than just a little motivated at the prospect of their task. After all, being trusted with this was, in a way, an indirect concession to their abilities in the wake of the successful job they had done during their sensei's previous task for them. Then, they had proven that they were both capable and trustworthy enough to act independently on their own without his supervision, convincing him to give them an even more important task as a result. To Shino, it felt as if he was truly making a substantial step forward in his career. He knew that he needed to keep a cool head, of course. He had always been proud of his self-control and didn't intend to give in to his emotions now of all times. That being said, he would lie if he claimed his heart hadn't been beating wildly in his chest ever since he and Kiba had once again separated from Hinata and Ataka-sensei. It took a considerable effort to keep his face calm and relaxed, too. This opportunity right now was the result of all the effort he, and his team as well, of course, had put into their training, and Shino had no intention of letting it go to waste. Unfortunately, reality quickly caught up with him. Regardless of what he might have imagined would happen once they found Mikata and his group, all that awaited them from then on onwards was boredom. Catching up with them took Kiba and him a little more than a day, finding them just as they were in the process of making camp not far from the scene of the boar attack. Judging from the chatter from the men they observed, they had apparently found the lack of corpses just as concerning as they had, and the reason they chose to camp here was that they wanted to remain close while they examined the site some more. Making out their main target, Mikata, was easy enough. Although all the men wore armor, he was the only one whose armor was dark red and not blue like the others, letting him stand out a lot and consequently making their job a lot easier. Furthermore, he didn't seem to do much whatsoever, choosing to remain in the camp for most of the time they observed him while delegating pretty much any responsibility and authority to those around him. In fact, most days, he only left his tent to get some food or to follow the call of nature. Shino probably didn't need to explain why that was far from exciting. There wasn't even much else going on in the camp around their target that could somehow distract them from the whole lot of nothing they had to do. There were actually much fewer people here than he expected considering Itaka-sensei had told them that Mikata left with a large group of people. It was to the point where a small part of Shino wondered how they had managed to get all these carts that now served as little more than a glorified barrier around the camp all this way here in such a short amount of time with how few men with horses were present. If Shino was bored, however, Kiba was desperate. Where he had done a pretty good job of keeping a grip on himself, Kiba, who just like him had expected something more interesting than this waiting game, had grown impatient within the first 24 hours. If he was honest with himself, Shino was surprised he had even kept it together that long. No matter how much Kiba had improved over the last 2 months, he was still a rather impatient person, after all. "This is ridiculous," his teammate said from where he was sitting on a branch a little bit below him. "They came to retrieve the bodies of the dead, right? They have been half-heartedly poking at the remnants of the caravan for days now. Why are they still here? Shouldn't they have realized that there is nothing to retrieve and gone home already?" Shino barely stopped himself from shooting Kiba a withering look when he replied, forcefully keeping his voice calm as he did so. "And how am I supposed to know the answer to that?" "You aren't," Kiba replied without a second's hesitation, much less caring about sounding polite than Shino had been. "They're being stupid, that's all. There's nothing to answer, that's why it's called a rhetorical question." He was tempted to say something along the lines of, "I'm surprised you know such big words," but managed to keep these thoughts to himself. The two of them got better along now than they did during their academy days even though they had actually been part of the same group of friends during that time for years, and after the fiasco with Team Guy a bit over a month ago, they even managed to build a rapport where they could quarrel with each other without hard feelings being involved, but right now, Shino had no doubt that such a comment would result in a real fight and didn't think it wise to endanger their mission like that. "It's not as simple as them being stupid," he said instead, inwardly chiding himself when his voice came out a tad colder than intended. "Why? The situation is too suspicious to be left alone just like that, but as there is no trail for them to follow either, so they found themselves at a dead end." Kiba scoffed. "Then the smart thing would be to retreat and report back to their lord so that he can decide what to do next. Nobody likes to be the bearer of bad news, and I'm sure our target doesn't want to return empty-handed either. So what? Whether they like it or not, they failed, so they should at least have the guts to admit it. Would you immediately return to Sensei and admit you failed your mission if a problem were to emerge right now, then?" Because Shino probably would not. He knew it wasn't right, but he was self-aware enough to at least admit to himself that he would likely first try to solve the problem himself before he admitted defeat, unless it was something truly insurmountable, that it. Judging from Kiba's silence, he seemed to think along the same lines. Fortunately for both of them, before their discussion could escalate, the conversation from a returning scouting party caught both their attention. "But why would there be such a large camp out here? There must have been at least a few dozen people. It's not like we're the only ones to use this route. It's a pretty busy street, actually. It's not much of a stretch that a passing group made a stop there to rest for the night. No way. It was much too far off the route for that. I still think we should send a rider with a message to Dash." You know that the captain had said, "Unless it's an emergency, we are not to send any rider back," and this hardly qualifies for that. If an abandoned camp of unknown nature doesn't qualify as an emergency, what does? You think too much into this. If you just search for long enough, you will find. The words became quieter as the two men walked on until they finally fell silent altogether when the distance became too great, but that didn't matter. They had heard the important bits. Shino and Kiba looked at each other for a moment, thinking the exact same thing while their earlier conversation was already forgotten. There was obviously no 100% guarantee, but in all likelihood, the camp the scouts had been talking about was the one the two of them had found before. The one with the members of the caravan that Mikado and his men were looking for right now. It was not necessarily a surprise that they were gone now. They had no reason to stay there infinitely, after all. If anything, it was actually a surprise that they had stayed there as long as they did. In all likelihood, they had left the area days ago and were long since gone by now, scattered in the wind and never to be seen again. We should have kept an eye on them as well, Shino thought, annoyed with himself for not thinking about that earlier. I understand that we're only 4 people and thus can do only so much at the same time, but they were important witnesses. Leaving them unmonitored and allowing them to flee was a stupid mistake. He was so annoyed, in fact, that it didn't even occur to him what other implications the merchant's absence might have, and because of what happened next, he didn't have the time to think about it some more and notice it either. Akamaru, who until now had been napping on Kiba's lap, jumped to his feet and spun around, his nose high in the air. "What is it, boy?" Kiba immediately asked even as he began to sniff around as well, trying to find what it was his partner had noticed. "You smell something." Shino had no other choice but to wait and watch as his teammate and his Ninken silently communicated with each other. He did send his Kikaichu out to scout the area, of course, but unless whatever he was looking for truly stood out somehow, it was unlikely that they would be of much use. Kiba and Akamaru were much better at finding people from afar, so by the time his insects had crossed the distance to whatever, or, more likely, whoever, their target was, his teammates would probably have already located them. This assumption was proven right a moment later when Kiba spoke up. "I don't recognize it, but Akamaru says he caught this scent when we were following the trails of the boars last week." Shino remembered that. While he and Hinata had gotten a lesson about the summoning technique from their sensei's clone, the real one had taken Kiba and Akamaru with him to see if there was anything that could lead them to the culprits. And indeed, there had been one scent found by Akamaru in a clearing not too far from the town. While the attempt to follow it back to its source had failed back then, it clearly benefited them now. Kiba was waiting for his response, but Shino couldn't bring himself to reply immediately. There was an enemy shinobi, the one responsible for summoning the boars that had attacked both the caravan and the town, closing in on them right now, probably with no good intentions. Considering it was unlikely that they were coming for him and Kiba, and well aware that the only other people in the area was the group they had been observing for the last few days, it also took no effort to conclude who the target was. So Mikado isn't the culprit, then. The captain of the guards had been one of the 2 main suspects, but if one of the enemy shinobi was now targeting him, his innocence was all but proven. They were still dealing with missing nins, though, so it wasn't impossible that Mikado was the culprit after all, and the shinobi he had hired simply wanted to get rid of him for one reason or another, which was rare but not exactly unheard of. It was also not out of the question that this mercenary was merely on their way to report to their client. Still, for now, the most likely conclusion was that Mikado was innocent, so that was the scenario Shino would base his thoughts on. They couldn't allow the captain to be killed, so his protection had priority. Trying to escape wasn't an option, though. It was pretty much impossible that they would be able to flee with a civilian in tow when it was a shinobi that was after them. Things might have been different if the captain were a samurai who could use chakra, but while some of his men were, he unfortunately was not. Thus, they had to take care of the enemy the old-fashioned way. Maybe he was jumping to this approach a tad too quickly, but he couldn't help it. Besides, it wasn't as if he hadn't first considered another possibility, so Shino reasoned that this decision was more than justified. Now only the questions of how and where remained. They could confront the enemy here with the backing of the soldiers, about a third of which were samurai, but that was risky. Not only would the non-samurai be little more than cannon fodder, but none of the actual samurai looked like they were particularly strong either. And if Shino, who was only a relatively fresh genin himself, thought so, there was no way they could be very capable. So, even if he and Kiba could reveal themselves, make them trust them, and explain the situation to them in time, they would probably not be of much help. Another possibility was to confront the approaching enemy by themselves as far away from the camp as possible. After several seconds that felt like an eternity, he made his decision. "Let's go." It was two simple words, but that's all it took for Kiba to break into a fierce grin. Clearly, he had been hoping Shino would say something like that. So, without any further words, they jumped into action, Kiba and Akamaru leading the way while he followed after them. This is it, he thought, squashing the hint of unease he felt in favor of focusing on his excitement. Our first real fight against another shinobi. It wasn't as if Shino wasn't aware of the potential danger they were putting themselves in. He was. Even if it was justified in this particular situation, it didn't change the fact that they might very well die, and normally, he would have taken that much more seriously. Right now, however, he couldn't, no, he didn't want to do so. While being aware of the danger was a good thing, he needed to keep a clear head. He would only panic if he thought too deeply about this. "We can do this," he told himself. "We have trained for this and we have the element of surprise on our side. For all I know, the fight could be over in an instant." They needed to look forward, not back. They made their choice, so it was important to prepare for what was to come instead of showing insecurity in their decision. That was the only way they could win. Shino had to believe that. Chapter 60, Kabasawa Mines 6. Let's start this from the beginning. Kabasawa Mines 6. There was only one instance Hinata could remember during which she had experienced killing intent directed at herself. It had happened shortly after their sparring session with Team Guy. Having evidently decided to one-up their training regime, Itaka-sensei had demonstrated just how terrifying it could be to be on the receiving end of killing intent. He had held back, of course, and the knowledge that they weren't really in danger had helped as well, but the experience had nonetheless been intense for not only her but Shino and Kiba as well. Now, however, she was more grateful for it than she could have ever imagined at the time. After all, as scary as it was to be on the receiving end of it once again, her opponent's killing intent was almost negligible compared to her sensei's, and it was for that reason Hinata didn't freeze when another handful of these flashes flew toward her. "Oh, come on," the petite woman whined in a high-pitched voice as she watched Hinata jump away to avoid her attacks, looking down on her from her position on top of the wall. "Why are you dodging? Don't tell me half a dozen projectiles are already too much for you." Hinata ignored the comment, well aware that she couldn't allow herself to be riled up like this. "I need to get closer," she thought while swallowing the lump she felt in her throat at this idea. "She has the advantage right now, but if I can cross the distance, I..." As if reading her mind, another volley of projectiles, at least 3 times as many as before, flew toward her and forced Hinata to focus solely on defending herself rather than on how to attack. Abruptly changing direction, she jumped back to avoid the brunt of the attack while blocking the few stray shots that came dangerously close with her palms. In theory, that should have been it, but just like the last time, she felt her hand heating up with every successfully blocked projectile. Before, she had been distracted by her emotions to give it much thought, but now, things were different. Now she realized that this wasn't normal and couldn't mean anything good. Using her Byakugan to get a look at her palms while still keeping most of her attention on her opponent proved that suspicion to be true. While not yet injured, they were clearly inflamed, and while she couldn't see colors with her dojutsu activated, Hinata was sure they would be bright red. Her opponent could impossibly know where Hinata was looking at any given moment, but that apparently didn't stop her from guessing correctly. "Oh my, so you finally noticed? Took you long enough." She then giggled, the innocent and, as much as Hinata hated to admit it, melodic sound that was so out of place on a battlefield making Hinata shudder. "For all the pride your clan seems to have in these fancy eyes of yours, you're rather blind, aren't you? One would think something like this would be hard to miss, but oh well. You wouldn't be the first Hyuga to fall for this, and you certainly won't be the last." "Not the first Hyuga," Hinata muttered, her forehead furrowed. The woman had said something similar earlier, too. My techniques are perfectly suited to kill your lot, YC. One could even say they're tailor-made just for that very purpose. Something about that rang a bell in her head. These comments about her, or, more importantly, her family's, techniques aiming at the Hyuga clan's weaknesses and even the attacks themselves were somehow familiar. It felt as if she had heard about all of this before, as if she should recognize them, but no matter how hard she tried, she just... Suddenly, her eyes widened. You're from the Teo clan. How could I not recognize her? She berated herself, all the panic she had managed to suppress so far returning with a vengeance. I should have realized it from the start. The Teo clan was in many ways a Hyuga's worst nightmare. Originating from the Land of Wind, they were a relatively small but influential clan that was one of the first ones to join their nation's hidden village back in the day. The secret technique they used was similar to the one of Konoha's Nara clan, but instead of controlling shadows, they bound light to their will and used it in battle. Hinata remembered what she had been taught about them in her lessons. About the havoc they caused not only in the last 3 wars but also all the way back during the Warring States period. Usually, while also effective in single combat, their skill set was most suited for a support role, but when their opponent was a Hyuga, things were different. Then, their techniques became absolutely deadly. Bright, dazzling light was, after all, one of if not the greatest weakness of the Byakugan, and Atao's techniques were neither as weak nor as limited as a simple flash bomb might be. There were ways to defend against them, of course. Hinata's ancestors would obviously not have accepted that they were completely defenseless against any foe and thus invested much time and energy in finding ways to counter them. That being said, just like they looked for possible counters, the Teo in turn looked for ways to overcome them. Consequently, while it wasn't entirely one-sided, the Teo clan still held a big advantage over the Hyuga. Furthermore, what counters existed weren't meant for fresh genin but experienced ninja. Even though Hinata remembered some of the strategies that proved successful in the past, she wouldn't be able to use them, at least not very effectively. She had been told growing up to either avoid such a confrontation altogether or, if that wasn't an option, try to flee and get some reinforcement at the earliest opportunity. Unfortunately, neither of these things was an option right now. Some emotion Hinata couldn't quite place flashed in her opponent's eyes as her till then amused smile turned into something more sinister. Bravo, little one. It seems you aren't completely clueless after all. However, I left that name behind when I deserted my village. These days, I'm just good ol Yawaku. Hinata barely registered these words. Not only was her opponent a few years older than her and had more experience, but she also used techniques that were super effective against her. She had planned to mostly stall and wait for reinforcements, hoping that the fleeing Nizu and her entourage would alert the guards and attack a sensei, but that didn't seem like such a good strategy anymore. It hadn't been a good plan before, but with Yawaku, Ateo, as her opponent, the situation had changed. After all, if her sensei was currently on patrol away from the mansion, all reinforcement she could get were some samurai at best and regular soldiers at worst. With such a dangerous opponent, that would probably not be enough. So, what was she supposed to do now? Oh, please don't make such a face, Yawaku continued, whatever emotion had gone through her earlier once again fully hidden behind a sweet smile as she pushed herself off the wall and onto the ground. You're too pretty to ruin your looks with such a frightened expression. Hinata's only reaction was to take another step back while trying her best not to tense and keep her form calm and relaxed. Yawaku buried her face in her hands with a sigh. Seriously, girls these days really don't know how to value their appearance, do they? You need to smile more and dash. She broke off in mid-sentence to lash out with her free hand, knocking the kunao that had flown straight at her head away before it could hit her. Really? Attacking me while I'm still talking? Don't they teach you manners in Konoha, or is this a Hyuga thing? You will never find a boyfriend if you behave like that, you know. A ninja must exploit every opening that presents itself to them. Hinata was proud to say that even though her heart was beating wildly in her chest and she could feel cold sweat running down her back, her voice barely wavered. Her opponent snorted at that, somehow managing to make even that sound delicate. Well said, she said amused. Or should I say well parroted. Not that it will do you much good, mind you, but I guess I can give you points for trying. Then, Her expression turned thoughtful. You know, the longer I think about it, the less I actually want to kill you. Why don't you desert your village and join us? What? She blurted that question out before she could stop herself. To be fair, however, that offer came out of nowhere. Why did that woman think she would even consider something like that? Just think about it for a moment. Yawako continued, growing visibly more and more excited about her own idea by the second. No matter whether it's Konoha, Suna, or any other of the hidden villages, the people living there are only tools to them to further their own power, the shinobi, their weapons to enforce their agendas. People like me whose families use secret techniques, and especially families like yours with special bloodlines, are nothing but well-bred attack dogs cherished for their potential use but without worth as an individual. As a missing nin, you would be free to do as you please and live your life as you want. There would be no duties to a village that doesn't give you anything in return, no duties to a clan that asks more and more of you until there's nothing of you left to give, and no false sense of camaraderie that's ultimately just one more chain binding you to the prison that is the village. The only person who would have power over you would be you yourself. For a moment, Hinata was too shocked to even think. Of all the things she might have expected, this certainly wasn't one of them. However, it was when she got over her initial surprise that the most unexpected thing of all happened. She felt pity for the other woman. If one read between the lines, look underneath the underneath, to quote what her sensei had once said, and think about Yawako's words, it wasn't hard to understand what motivated her. All these supposed advantages of being a missing nin and all these criticisms about the hidden villages probably stemmed from her personal experiences. She didn't just say all of this to convince her but actually and truly believed in what she said. To be so bitter about both her family and the place where she was born and raised, how could Hinata not pity her? Yes, her own relationship with her family was complicated to say the least, but not in 1,000 years could she imagine abandoning them. In fact, it was her dream to bring change to her clan and improve the lives of all its members, so how could she possibly just walk away from them? No, she said, and for the first time since Yawako's appearance, she didn't feel scared out of her mind. Hinata would be lying if she claimed to be completely calm, but at the very least, she felt as if she could think clearly now. Shinobi are humans, too, even if they have to serve as their village's swords. She remembered the few times the Sandaime took the time to visit the academy grounds and talk with the students, or the visits to the Hyuga compound to speak with her father about her clan's situation and whether there was anything he could help them with. If he, who was unquestionable in charge of the village, showed such obvious care, how could someone possibly claim that the people under his command were mere tools to him? My duties to my clan may be strenuous, but I fulfill them to help protect each of its members. All the lessons in etiquette and all the countless hours of training that went into mastering the gentle fist existed solely to prepare her for the day she would take over as head of the clan, when she would have to protect and nourish it so that the next generation could grow up happy and safe. An image of a grinning Hanabi flashed before her inner eye before she pushed it to the back of her mind. And you're wrong. I do get something in return for all my hard work. The thankful expressions of clients after yet another done D-rank mission, the tasks that were so menial to her team meaning so much more to Konoha's residents, the gleeful laughter of children that could grow up in peace, the warm feeling in her chest when her sensei, uncle, and sometimes even her father praised her achievements. There were many things she got for doing her part. Many things that made all the hard work worth it. Konoha is my home, and I won't abandon it. In truth, Hinata had never really thought in depth about her relationship with the village she had grown up in. Had never really thought about what the place meant to her. Now, however, after listening to such a dismissing point of view on them, all these things she had always known but never vocalized simply poured out of her. Yes, things weren't perfect, and no, not everything was fair, but that was not the point. These things could be improved with time, and right now, it was more important to focus on the positives. The things worth fighting for. Yawako's face remained expressionless for a few seconds before it suddenly transformed back into the same smile it had had before. Now, however, it somehow looked much more sinister. Well, that's a shame, she said, though her voice didn't sound disappointed at all. I would really have loved to have such a cute girl by my side, you know. I'm sure you would have grown up to be a beautiful woman, too. She sighed, this time wisely without burying her face in her hand. Nothing I can do about it, I guess. I will just have to settle for playing with you for a bit. I should even be able to earn some money with you as well. You don't have a seal on your forehead, so I can sell you and your eyes separately to get double the profit. Hinata swallowed once but managed to otherwise keep her composure. For a little more than a second, she hesitated. If she did what she had in mind, there would be no going back. No second chance. She would have to trust that she could stay alive until reinforcement arrived, preferably with Ataka-sensei as part of it. She had to accept that she might very well die. The thought scared her just as much as it had earlier, and as all of this went through her head, she could feel her knees shaking. However, unlike before, she didn't let that get the better of her and instead remembered her own words. She had something worth fighting for, so she couldn't back down no matter how terrified she might be. But if she wanted to fight Yawaku, Hinata had to make the first step. She couldn't leave the initiative to her opponent if she wanted to stand a chance. Maybe if she hit quick and hard enough before Yawaku could even react, Hinata could actually win this. Forcing all her doubts into the furthest corner of her mind until they were nothing more than a silent whisper in the back of her head that she could ignore, she pushed herself off the ground with as much power as she could muster. Unfortunately, rather than being caught off guard, Yawaku merely grinned as she clasped her hands together in front of her before Hinata had crossed even half the distance between them. Genwaku Teo. Blinding sun. A moment later, a radiant light flooded the area. When Ataka-sensei had finally decided to teach them ninjutsu, Kiba's mind had immediately jumped to all the amazing techniques he had heard and learned about growing up. To all the legendary shinobi whose prowess was enough to shatter mountains and split the sea. Then, when it turned out he had an earth affinity, his thoughts became more precise. From summoning 1,000 spikes from the ground to creating earthquakes, he imagined all the awesome things he would learn to do. Imagine his surprise, and more importantly, his disappointment, when the first actual technique he learned was how to move underground. Not that he stayed that for long, mind you. As it turned out, there were quite a few neat tricks one could do while hiding beneath the surface. The current situation was a perfect example. Kiba was waiting more or less patiently for his target to arrive, carefully paying attention to the vibrations of the steps that were constantly getting closer. He needed to strike at the most optimal time, neither too soon nor too late. After all, if he failed, it would be Akamaru and Shino who paid the price. Kiba jumped into action when he felt that his target was directly above him by pushing his hands through the surface. There was a surprised cry as Kiba grabbed the ankle of his target, who judging by the voice was a man, stopping him in his tracks before pulling them down until the man was buried in the ground halfway up his knees. That's what you get for not using the trees, idiot. Simultaneously, another set of vibrations a bit further away alerted him to the fact that the next phase of their trap had been initiated. Taking that as his cue, he let go of his target's ankles and emerged from the underground a few meters away just in time to witness Shino smacking the bulky man with long white hair, who was just in the process of straightening himself up, in the face with a 6-foot-long staff. Kiba, having been hit by the weapon himself more often than he could possibly count during their training sessions, winced in sympathy before getting a grip on himself. That wasn't the end of it yet, however. Normally, Shino's attack would have been enough to throw their opponent away, but with his legs stuck into the ground, it merely resulted in him tilting backwards until his back hit the ground with a bang. Then, capitalizing on the opportunity, Akamaru came flying down towards the man with a tsuga that hit him squarely on the chest, resulting in an explosion that shattered not only the ground but hopefully their opponent as well. And ultimately, finishing their ambush off, Shino sent a swarm of his insects that would suck the man dry of his chakra just in case he had somehow survived the previous attack to end this for good and leave him absolutely defenseless. All in all, their strategy worked as well as one could hope for, and although Kiba's own part in it was something he would usually consider boring, the fact that they had just beaten their first enemy shinobi ever was enough to satisfy him for the moment. "Heh, that's what I call a success," he exclaimed while throwing his fist into the air, quickly joined by an excited bark from Akamaru. That went like a charm. The effect of surprise is not to be underestimated. Even an otherwise superior opponent will fall if they don't get the chance to fight back. Don't be like that. I know you're feeling just as giddy about this as I am. Shino merely scoffed before looking away, but while his high collar and sunglasses might hide much of his face, it wasn't enough to hide the slight blush on his cheeks. Unfortunately, before Kiba could tease him about it, another voice spoke up. "You're rather excited for a bunch of children, aren't you?" For 1 second, nothing happened. Everything stood still. Then, just as Kiba realized what had just happened and was about to jump around, the insects around their supposedly beaten opponent were blasted away. What the dash? How dash? I can't believe some snotty-nosed brats got the drop on me, the white-haired man interrupted them both while slowly getting back up, pulling his feet out of the ground without any apparent trouble. My reputation would be ruined if anyone hears about this. This was the first time Kiba saw the man standing upright, so it was only now that he realized just how massive he was. He was at least 7 feet tall and packed from head to toe with muscles to the point where his arms were as thick as Kiba's head. Also, as if existing solely to enhance his menacing look, an angry scar ran from his left temple all the way over his eye and lips down his chin. However, the most noteworthy wasn't his general appearance but the complete lack of injuries. Their attacks had definitively connected. There was no doubt about that. The man wouldn't have hit the ground if Shino's staff attack hadn't hit his face, and the tattered remains of his sleeveless waistcoat proved that Akamaru's Tsuga had clearly hit as well. His nose should be shattered and his torso a bloody mess, but instead, none of that was the case. What was the case, on the other hand, was that there was some kind of transparent layer on his skin that sparkled in the sunlight. "Shino," he whispered without letting his eyes off the man, "any idea what that is?" Assumingly some kind of ninjutsu, Shino replied with what Kiba considered a supremely unhelpful answer. "Something that was a similar effect to your own technique, too. But it's transparent. It surely isn't some kind of earth release, and the other elements don't fit either. It might be a Kekii Genkai." "It is," the man spoke up, his voice an annoyed drawl. "Crystal release, to be more precise. You better don't expect any of your worthless attacks to work on me. None of them will break through my armor." "Crystal release," Shino muttered before visibly tensing as he realized something. "That's a bloodline from Uegaku, isn't it?" Kiba was far from the most well-versed person concerning other villages' clans and bloodlines, but even he recognized this one. And how couldn't he? The Kesho clan was famous, or rather, infamous, in Konoha for its deeds in the Third Great Ninja War, in particular for the creation of Chiwa Canyon, which lined almost the entire border with the lands of rain and grass and was one of the country's most powerful defenses. Last he heard, however, the clan actually went extinct at the tail end of the last war. "Congratulations for paying attention in history class," the man replied dryly. "Not that it will do you much good, but I guess it's better to die knowing what to expect instead of dying ignorantly, huh? Anyway, what I want to know is what you're doing here." Kiba took an impulsive step forward. "Well, why don't you tell us what you're doing here first?" "Calm down, Kiba," Shino said as he stepped up next to him to put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't let yourself be riled up." "Why?" "Because you will only play into his hands if you do." "Oh no," the other man chimed in, "let him be. I have no need to use such cowardly strategies to deal with the likes of you." "The likes of us, huh?" He ignored Shino's tightening hand on his shoulder. "And what do you mean with that?" "Nothing, nothing. All I'm trying to say is that some green genin fresh out of the academy aren't the likes of opponents I need to worry about. Now, if your sensei was here, well, then I would be in trouble. But the two of you on your own? No big deal. I will make you eat these words, you bastard. Itaka sensei trusted us to protect these people, so there's no way we will let you do as you please. So he really isn't here himself, then?" Kiba dash. Somewhere in the back of his head, he knew that he was playing right into his opponent's hands, but he couldn't help it in the heat of the moment. Shino's voice, too, was barely registered over the rush of anger and, although he would never admit it out loud, fear he felt at the moment. "Of course not. We're more than enough to take care of you." At once, the man's attitude changed completely. Where before, he had appeared to be somewhat annoyed but for the most part calm, all that vanished as his expression turned into an ugly snarl, the big scar making it look even more terrifying. "You're a real idiot, aren't you?" Even his voice sounded more sinister now. All you had to do was tell me he was somewhere around here and I would have had to run. Instead, you basically admitted to being helpless like a newborn baby even after your teammate tried to calm you down. Walking into such an obvious trap, seriously, don't they teach you anything in Konoha? Kiba opened his mouth, but no words came out. No way, he thought with growing panic. No fucking way did that just happen. Unfortunately, it very much had. Shit. The other man simply began to laugh. Kiba, Shino said, sounding more serious than he could remember him ever having been before, you need to calm down now. We need to come up with a plan. What good is a plan when I already fucked up? That dash. He's not wrong, their opponent interrupted them once again. It's already bad enough that you're only fresh genin while I'm an experienced shinobi. If you were at least from some clans with useful abilities, you might actually be able to put up somewhat of a fight, but judging from the ugly mud and all these insects, you're an Inyazuka and an Abarame, aren't you? He chuckled before turning towards Shino in particular. Damn, I actually pity you a bit, boy. I mean, what kind of sick family injects their children with bugs of all things? Shino didn't immediately react to that, but Kiba was more than accustomed enough to his behavior by now to note the way he tensed at that comment. One of the things he had learned early into their friendship was to never talk down on the other boy's clan, no matter how light-hearted the teasing might be. Kiba, he said, voice decisively calm. We can't let him go after the captain and his men. He nodded, throwing a dark glare at the white-haired man while trying his hardest to ignore the squeezy feeling in his stomach. I know. I propose we approach him with Plan Red. Sure. So you're really prepared to throw your lives away to protect some stupid fools you don't even know? The man gave another hearty laugh. I mean, I would obviously kill you regardless, but if you chose to run away now, you might actually have had a chance to get away. Now, it might not be the best idea to provoke their opponent even more, but Kiba couldn't keep his mouth shut. Although, to be fair, riling their opponent up was kind of part of Plan Red, so while it wasn't really his intention, he had no problem justifying his outburst with that reasoning in mind. Well, not everyone is a damn traitor who abandons their village at the first sign of trouble. The last traces of amusement fell from the man's face. Then, very well. If that's what you've decided, I will gladly oblige you. Kiba opened his mouth to shout another insult at him, but the missing nin was faster. He fell into a fighting stance and clapped his hands together. Just know that it was Guzen Kesho who killed you. Shoton, Doryaso. Crystal Release, Crystal Flow Spears. A second later, dozens of pale purple crystals burst from the ground. Check the description for the links to the author.